Welcome, dear listener, and welcome to the quiet of this hour. Wherever you are, and however far the day has carried you, you have come now to a place of rest, and there is nothing more you need to do tonight but let yourself grow still. So settle in beneath your blankets and let the weight of your body sink softly into the warmth around you. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and take one slow, deep breath, drawing the air gently in, holding it for a moment in the hush, and then letting it drift out again like a tide, easing back from the shore. Let your shoulders fall, let your hands grow heavy, let the small cares of the day loosen their hold one by one and slip away into the dark like leaves upon a slow river. Tonight we shall wander together into something very old and very deep, into a tower of shadow that once stood at the edge of the world, and we shall look upon it not with fear but with wonder, the way one looks upon a distant storm from the safety of a warm and shuttered room. And as we go, let the sound of these words carry you gently down, deeper and deeper toward the soft country of sleep, until at last you are dreaming. Rest now, you are safe. There is time for everything, and all of it is slow. Have you ever wondered what lay within the great dark tower of the enemy? Have you ever paused in the quiet of your own thoughts and asked what secrets were hidden behind those iron walls, upon that black hill, beneath the red and smouldering sky? What was it made of, and how was it raised, and who dwelt within its endless halls? What did its master keep in the deep places beneath its foundations, and why did it stand so long, and how, in the end, did it fall? These are the questions we shall drift among tonight, gently, one after another, the way a traveler on a slow road turns a curious stone over and over in his hand. There was a tower once in the eastern lands of Middle-earth called Barad-dûr in the elven tongue, which means the Dark Tower, and it was the stronghold and the dwelling of Sauron, the great deceiver, the Lord of Shadow, and no work of malice ever raised in that world was greater or more terrible than this. Yet you need not fear it, for all of this is long ago and far away, a tale recounted in the hush of night, and nothing within it can reach you here beneath your warm blankets. Before we begin our journey, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is in your corner of the world, for it is a gentle comfort to think of us all drifting towards sleep, together beneath the same wide sky, some beneath morning light and some beneath deep midnight. So if you feel moved to, leave a soft word in the comments and tell me where you are, and let us share that small, cozy thread of connection across all the miles between us. And now, with that said, let us begin. To truly understand this tower of shadow and all that it held and all that it meant, we must drift back, far back, to the very beginning, before ever a single stone of it was laid, back to the days when the world was young and the one who would build it had not yet fallen into the dark. In the beginning, before the shaping of the lands and the kindling of the stars, there was one who made all things, and in the great silence he brought forth spirits out of his thought, divine and deathless, to be the powers of the world that was to come. The mightiest of these were called the Valar, the lords and the queens of the world, and beneath them, more numerous and no less fair, were the Maiar, the spirits who served them and worked with them in the ordering of all things. And among these Maiar, in that first and untroubled dawn, there was one who shone with a keen and formidable light, one who was numbered among the followers of Aule the smith, the great craftsman of the Valar, who delighted in the substances of the earth, in stone and metal, in gem and ore, in the making of things with skill and care. This spirit was in that early age called Mairon, which is to say the admirable, for he was admired then by his fellows, being wise and strong and surpassingly skilled in the works of his master's craft. He loved order and pattern and the arrangement of things according to a plan. He loved to see a thing made well and made swiftly and made to endure, and in itself there was no evil in this, for the love of craft and the desire to shape and to build are good things, and many fair works have come of them. Yet even in the finest gifts there may lie a seed that, if it is not tended with humility, may grow crooked in the dark. For you see, dear listener, this spirit who was called Mairon loved order so greatly that in time he came to love it more than the things it was meant to serve. He wished to see the world set right, as he understood rightness. He wished to see waste ended and disorder tamed, and all things brought into a single harmonious design, moving without flaw according to a single guiding will. And little by little, so slowly that perhaps he himself did not mark the turning, he came to feel that the will best fitted to guide all things was his own, and that if only others would yield to him and follow his plan, then all would at last be made perfect. This is the quiet way that many a bright thing is lost, not in a single great fall, but in 1,000 small surrenders, each of them wearing the mask of reason, each of them whispering that the end is good and so the means may be forgiven. And it was in this frame of mind, restless and proud and hungry for a world that would obey, that Mairon came within the shadow of one far greater and far darker than himself. For among the Valar there had been one, the mightiest of all in the beginning, whose name was Melkor, he who arose in power and in might above his brethren, and who fell furthest of all into ruin. Melkor too had loved to shape and to make, but he had wished to make things wholly his own, out of nothing, by his own will alone, and when he could not, his desire had curdled into envy, and his envy into hatred, and his hatred into a vast and cold desire to mar and to unmake all that others had wrought. He wandered the empty places of the world, nursing his grievances, and he gathered to himself those spirits whom he could bend, some by fear and some by flattery and some by the promise of power. And to Mairon, who loved order and strength and the swift accomplishment of great designs, Melkor offered exactly what such a spirit most desired. Not chaos, but a mastery so complete that nothing could ever again resist it. Not ruin for its own sake, but a world remade wholly in the image of a single will, ordered down to the smallest grain, and ruled without question forever. And Mairon, who should have known better, and who in his heart perhaps did know better, chose that path, and gave himself over to the darker lord, and became his chief servant and his most faithful lieutenant. Thereafter he was no longer called the Admirable, but came to be known by other names, and the name by which the world would remember him with dread was Sauron, the abhorred, the cruel. Now it is worth our while to pause here in the hush, and to sit with this a moment, for it tells us something about the tower we are journeying toward, something we shall carry with us through all the long history to come. Sauron did not begin as a monster. He began as a craftsman, one who loved to build, one who admired the well-made thing and the enduring work. And when at last he raised his own great fortress upon the black hill of Mordor, he didn't raise it as a beast might raise a rude den, but as a master builder raises a masterwork with skill and cunning and a terrible care. The Dark Tower would be, in its dreadful way, the greatest achievement of that fallen craft, the thing into which he poured the whole of his gathered knowledge and his gathered will. It would be beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, or a storm. It would be perfect in its proportions and unbreakable in its strength, because the one who made it had once loved perfection above all things, and had never, even in his ruin, ceased to love it. And this, perhaps, is part of why it was so terrible. For evil that is merely wild and stupid may be endured and outlasted, but evil that is patient and skilled and orderly, and that builds toward its ends across the slow turning of the ages, is a far heavier shadow to stand beneath. yet stand beneath it we shall, only as watchers, only as listeners, drifting above it like a bird high in the safe night air, looking down upon it from a great and comfortable height, while sleep gathers softly around us. Through the long wars of the elder days, Sauron served his dark master faithfully, and grew in cunning and in cruelty, and learned the arts of deception and of dominion. He was a shapeshifter in those days, able to take many forms, fair and foul, and he wielded terror as a craftsman wields a favored tool. Yet the age of Melkor came at last to its end, for the powers of the West rose up against him in wrath, and there was a great war, and the Dark Lord Melkor was overthrown and cast out beyond the walls of the world, into the outer void, so that his shadow should trouble the earth no more in his own person. And when that war was ended, and his master was gone, Sauron stood for a moment upon a threshold, alone. He might have repented then. It is said that for a while he was afraid, and that some part of him wished to turn back and to sue for pardon, and that had he been willing to humble himself and to submit to judgment, he might yet have found some measure of grace. But pride is a heavy chain, and the thought of standing before the powers of the West as a suppliant, of laying down his own will and confessing his ruin, was more than he could bear, and so he hid himself instead and slipped away into the shadows of Middle-earth, and there he remained while the ages turned, nursing in secret the old dream that had never truly left him, the dream of order and mastery, and a world made wholly obedient to a single guiding hand. Thus the seed of the Dark Tower was already planted, long before its first stone was laid, in the heart of one who could not let go of the wish to rule. And so the ages turned, and the world changed, and there came a time long after the fall of Melkor that we call the Second Age of Middle-earth, a long and fateful span of years in which much was built and much was lost. In those days the elves who remained in the mortal lands dwelt in fair realms, and the race of men was young and scattered, and the great island of Númenor rose out of the sea as a gift to the faithful among men, and for a while there was peace, or something near to peace, across the wide lands. But Sauron had not been idle in the shadows. Through the long years of his hiding he had watched and waited and gathered his strength again in secret, and little by little he came forth once more, no longer the servant of another, but a lord in his own right, master of himself and of his own dark purpose. And now the old dream rose up in him with a new and terrible clarity, for with Melkor gone beyond the world, there was none left to command him, and it seemed to him that the time had come at last to make the world his own, to bring all its peoples and all its lands under a single rule, his rule ordered and obedient and unchanging forever. Yet he had learned patience in his long defeat, and he didn't rush headlong into open war as his old master had done. He chose instead a slower and more cunning path, the path of deceit, of counsel and gift and quiet persuasion, and it is upon that path that we find him as he begins to look about the lands of Middle-earth for a place to raise his stronghold. Now, Sauron was wise in the reading of the land, as befit one who had been a craftsman of the earth's own substances in the deeps of time, and when he came at last into the eastern regions of Middle-earth, into a certain black and broken country, he knew that he had found what he sought, for there lay a land that seemed almost to have been shaped for his purpose, a wide plateau of ash and stone ringed about on three sides by tall and jagged mountains, as though some giant hand had built a great wall to fence it off from all the gentler lands beyond. To the north rose the Ash Mountains, grim and grey. To the west and the south rose the Mountains of Shadow, sheer and cruel, and within this vast enclosing ring lay a desolate plain where little grew and little lived, a place of cinders and cracked stone and bitter dust. And in the northwestern quarter of that plain there stood a single mountain, apart from the others, a mountain that smoked and smouldered and burned in its heart with a fire that never wholly died, a mountain of restless flame, that the elves in later days would name Barad-dûr, the mountain of blazing fire, and that men would come to call Mount Doom. This land Sauron chose for his own, and he named it Mordor, which in the black speech and in the tongues of fear came to mean simply the Black Land, the land of shadow, and it was to be his dwelling and his fortress and the seat of his power for age upon age to come. And you may imagine, if you like, from your safe and drowsy distance, how it must have looked in those first days, before ever a tower stood upon it. A wide, dim plain under a heavy sky, the mountains standing black against the dull red glow of the burning mountain, the air thick and still, no bird song, no running water, only the far, low murmur of the fire in the deep places of the earth. It was a lonely and a fearful land, and yet to Sauron it was beautiful, for it was defensible, and it was hidden, and above all it held that mountain of fire, whose secret worth he alone at first perceived. For here, dear listener, we come to one of the deep secrets of the Dark Tower, a secret woven into its very foundations, and to understand the tower we must first understand the fire that fed it. Sauron had conceived a design more subtle and more dreadful than any mere fortress of stone, a design by which he hoped to gather all the strength of his enemies into his own hand, and to rule the peoples of Middle-earth not by open conquest alone, but by a hidden and unbreakable dominion of the will. And the heart of this design was a work of craft, the greatest and the darkest work he ever attempted, and it could not be made in any ordinary forge, for it required a heat and a power that only the fires at the roots of that burning mountain could supply. And so, before ever the tower was raised to its full and terrible height, Sauron turned his thought first to the mountain, and to the thing he meant to make within it, and to the long, slow labor of deceit by which he meant to draw the fairest craftsman of Middle-earth into the weaving of his snare. To follow that thread, we must leave Mordor for a while and go westward to the land of the elven smiths, and see how the trap was baited before ever it was sprung. In the middle years of the Second Age there dwelt in a fair green country a company of elves who were the most skilled craftsmen of their kind, smiths and jewel-wrights and workers of subtle metals, and they had founded a realm devoted to the making of beautiful and cunning things. They loved Middle-earth, and they were loath to see it fade and change as the slow years wore away the freshness of the world. And above all, they longed to keep the things they loved from passing, to hold the light of the elder days undimmed against the coming of the dark. And it was into the midst of these elves that Sauron came, in a fair form and under a fair name, presenting himself not as a lord of shadow, but as an emissary of the powers of the West, a friend to the elves, a teacher and a giver of gifts, wise in lore and eager to share it. He called himself in those days the Lord of Gifts, and he was gracious and patient and full of knowledge, and he offered to teach the elven smiths the deep arts of making, the secrets by which a craftsman might pour something of his own strength and will into the thing he wrought, so that it should hold power beyond its mere shape. And the smiths, who longed to preserve the things they loved, and who did not perceive the shadow behind the fair mask, welcomed him and learned from him, and worked long years at his side. Only the wisest among the elves mistrusted him, and would have no dealings with him, and they were proved right in the end. But many others were beguiled, for the gifts he offered were exactly the gifts their own hearts most desired, and that is ever the way of the most dangerous temptations, that they come to us wearing the shape of our own longing. Out of this long collaboration came the rings of power, wrought by the elven smiths with the knowledge Sauron had taught them, rings of great virtue and beauty, able to preserve and to heal and to hold back the weariness of the world. And the elves made many of these, and among them 3 of surpassing power and purity, which they made in secret, and with their own art alone, untouched by Sauron's hand, so that these three at least were free of his malice. But Sauron had not taught his craft out of friendship, and he had a further and a hidden purpose that the smiths did not guess. For he went away into the east, back to the burning mountain in the black land of Mordor, and there in the fires at the roots of the world, he labored in secret at a work of his own, a single ring into which he poured not merely a portion of his skill, but the very greater part of his own native power, his strength and his will and his cruelty and his desire to dominate all things. This was the one ring, the ruling ring, and it was made to be the master of all the others, so that whosoever wore the lesser rings should fall, whether they knew it or not, under the sway of the one who wore the one. And it is worth our while to sit a moment with the strangeness of this, for it is bound up with the tower we are journeying toward. Sauron put so much of himself into that small circle of gold that his own being became bound to it. His power thereafter lived in part outside his body, hidden in a thing that could be lost or hidden, or in the end unmade. He had made himself stronger, and yet in the same act he had made himself terribly vulnerable, tying the whole of his fate to a single fragile object, so that the tower that would one day rise upon the strength of that ring would stand only so long as the ring endured. But all of that lay far in the future, on that day when he first forged it in the mountain's fire, and for the moment he was triumphant, for the trap was set. Now at last we come to the raising of the tower itself, and here we must slow our steps and linger, for this is the heart of our tale, and there is much to wonder at in the making of it. When Sauron had forged the one ring in the fires of the mountain, and had bound so much of his power into it, he found himself mightier than he had ever been before, and it was then, with that ring upon his hand, that he set about building the great fortress from which he meant to rule the world. He raised it upon a spur of the mountains of Shadow, in the northwestern reaches of Mordor, upon a great black shoulder of rock that thrust out from the range and stood over the plain, and he built it to be the greatest and the strongest and the most enduring stronghold that had ever been raised by any hand in the mortal lands. And the name that the elves gave it was Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, and by that name it is remembered with dread through all the long chronicles of Middle-earth. Yet the raising of it was no ordinary labor of stone upon stone, for Sauron didn't build it as men or even as the elves build, and here lies one of the deepest of its secrets. For Sauron poured into the making of Barad-dur a portion of the same power that he had put into the ring, so that the tower and the ring were bound together, the one sustaining the other. He did not merely quarry stone and lift it and mortar it into place. He wrought the foundations of the tower with the strength of the ring itself, delving them deep into the living rock of the mountain and binding them there with a power that was more than the power of any mason. And because so much of his own will and malice went into those foundations, they took on something of the endurance of the ring, so that they could not be broken or thrown down by any might of hand or engine so long as the ring endured and its master's will sustain them. This is a thing worth pausing over, for it is strange and it is terrible. The tower did not stand merely because it was well built, though it was built with a craft beyond reckoning. It stood because a portion of a fallen spirit's very being had been woven into its roots, so that to unmake the tower one would have to unmake the will that held it, and that will was hidden away in a small circle of gold that few even knew existed. The Dark Tower, then, was in a sense not wholly a thing of stone at all, but a thing of stone quickened and held together by a malice older than the kingdoms of men, a fortress that was also, in some hidden way, an extension of its master's own dark heart. And this is why, long after, when at last it fell not slowly and stone by stone, as a ruined castle falls, but all at once, in a single catastrophe, in the very hour that the will sustaining it was undone. Let us try gently to picture it as it stood, though no words can wholly hold it, and though you must remember always that you are only a watcher, hovering high and safe in the cool night air, looking down upon it as one looks upon a thing in a dream. Barad-dur rose in tiers, one above another, terrace upon terrace, and rampart upon rampart, climbing up from the black roots at its base to a dizzying unvarying and impossible height, so that its uppermost pinnacles seemed to pierce the low and smoky heaven, and to stand among the clouds of ash that drifted forever over that land. Its walls were of a dark, iron-hard stone, black and grim, and they were reinforced with iron and with adamant, that hardest of substances, so that they shone dully where the red light of the burning mountain caught them, like the scales of some vast sleeping serpent. It was crowned with great battlements and turrets, and pierced with countless windows that looked out like watching eyes over the plain below, and its gates were of iron, and about its feet lay walls within walls, and courts within courts, a whole city of shadow gathered at the base of the central tower, and it was crowned at its very summit with a topmost tower and a high chamber, and above that in later days there burned the thing that all the land could see, and none could escape, the red and lidless eye, wreathed in flame that was the visible sign and the searching gaze of the will that dwelt within. But we shall come to the eye in its own time, for it belongs to the later age of the tower's history, and there is much to tell before then. Consider the sheer bulk and mass of the thing, if your drowsy mind will hold it for a moment before letting it drift away again. It was not a single slender spire, but a mountain of masonry in its own right, a black artificial peak set upon the shoulder of a real one, so vast that armies could be housed within its lower levels and mustered upon the plains beneath its gates. Its foundations went down and down into the roots of the mountain, into deep places of stone where no daylight had ever come nor ever would, and there, far below the level of the plain, lay dungeons and vaults and pits and cellars, chamber beneath chamber, delved by the hands of slaves and bound by the power of the ring, and all of it was made without love and without joy, and without any of the small graces that soften the works of gentler builders. There were no gardens in Barad-dur, no fountains for beauty's sake, no carvings made merely because they were fair to look upon. Everything served a purpose, and the purpose was power, and so the whole vast structure had about it a cold and pitiless perfection, an order without warmth, a strength without kindness. It was, one might say, the truest portrait of its maker that ever was made, for in it you could read the whole of what Sauron had become. The old love of order turned to tyranny, the old delight in craft turned to the manufacture of fear, the bright, admirable spirit of the beginning hardened and blackened into a single towering monument to the will to dominate. And yet, and this is a strange thing to say of so dreadful a place, there was in it a kind of terrible grandeur, and it is right that we should acknowledge it, for it helps us to understand why so many feared it and why it stood so long. To stand upon the plain of Gorgoroth and to look up at the dark tower rising black against the sullen sky, tier upon tier, higher than any natural thing, was to feel oneself very small, and to feel the weight of an age-old malice pressing down like the weight of the mountains themselves. It was built to overawe, to crush the spirit before ever a blow was struck, to say to every eye that beheld it that resistance was folly and that the shadow would endure forever. And in that, for long ages, it succeeded, for few who looked upon it could keep hope alive in their hearts. But we, dear listener, need feel none of that dread, for we look upon it now across the safe gulf of the ages, in the warm dark of our own quiet room, and we may wonder at its dreadful magnificence, as we might wonder at the memory of a storm long spent, knowing that its thunder can never reach us, and that its shadow has long since passed away from the world. But the question that gives our tale its name is not only what the tower looked like from without, but what lay within it, behind those iron walls, and beneath those black battlements. And so let us drift now, gently and without fear, in through the great gates and into the shadowed heart of the fortress, to wander its halls in imagination as one wanders a place in a dream, touching nothing, harmed by nothing, only looking. Imagine yourself, if you will, borne softly on the still air, passing over the high outer walls and down into the first of the courts, and see how the whole place is ordered like the workings of some vast and pitiless engine, every part fitted to its purpose. There would have been great gates of iron hung upon hinges as thick as a man's body, opening onto wide paved courts where the servants of the Dark Lord mustered and marched. There would have been guard rooms and barracks and mustering yards, level upon level, where the armies of Mordor were housed and armed and set in their orders. For the tower was not only a dwelling but a citadel and a garrison, and it held within its walls a multitude beyond counting. And through all of these lower levels there would have run a constant low murmur, the tramp of feet and the clang of iron, and the harsh voices of captains, and over it all the deep, dull throb of the forges, never silent, never resting, day and night alike. For in the Black Land there was no true day nor honest night, but only a smoky twilight beneath the drifting ash. Go deeper, in your mind's eye, and you would come to the forges themselves, and here the heat would grow, and the red light would grow, for the whole of Mordor was in a sense one great workshop of war, and the tower was its beating heart, in vast vaulted chambers, lit by the glare of furnaces and the running of molten metal. The smiths and the slaves of Sauron labored without cease at the making of weapons and armor and engines of war, blades by the thousands, spearheads and arrowheads without number, helms and shields and coats of mail, and the great iron-shod battering rams and the siege engines that would one day be dragged out across the plain to break the gates of the free peoples. And the air in those places would have been thick and hot and bitter with the reek of smoke and hot iron and the sweat of toil, and the light would have been the sullen red of the forge fire, throwing long shadows that leaped and shuddered upon the black walls. It was industry without joy, making without love. The craft that Sauron had once delighted in turned wholly to the service of ruin, and the labor of it fell upon a multitude of thralls, captives and slaves, driven ceaselessly at their work, so that the tower fed upon suffering as surely as its forges fed upon fire. Yet you need feel no dread of this, dear listener, for it is a thing recounted and long past, a shadow of an age that is gone. We look upon those old red forges as we might look upon the last embers of a fire raked over and dying, their heat long since cooled to nothing, their labor long since ended, their smoke long since blown away upon the winds of time. Rise again in your imagination, up through the levels of the tower, past the barracks and the forges and the mustering halls, up the long stairs and the winding ways that climbed through the black stone, and you would come at last to the higher chambers where the great captains of Mordor had their dwelling. For Sauron did not rule alone. He had beneath him lords and lieutenants of dread, and chief among these were 9, the ring-wraiths, the Nazgul, who had once been kings and lords among men, and who had been ensnared and enslaved by 9 of the lesser rings of power until they faded out of the living world and became shadows bound wholly to the will of the Dark Lord. These were the most terrible of his servants, wraiths clad in the seeming of black robes, whose faces could not be seen, whose voices were cold, whose very presence spread a numbing dread before them like a chill wind. And in the upper halls of Barad-dur they had their places, coming and going at their master's bidding, riding forth upon his errands and returning again to the shadow of his tower. There would have been high halls there, vast and dim and cold, floored with black stone, and hung perhaps with black iron, halls without warmth or comfort, where no hearth fire ever burned for cheer, but only the pale, unnatural lights that the servants of shadow use. And in those halls the will of the Dark Lord was law, absolute and unquestioned, and every servant, from the least orc drudge in the forges to the greatest of the nine, moved always beneath the pressure of that single overmastering will, as fish move beneath the weight of the deep sea. And beneath all this, far below the plain, in the deep foundations that the power of the ring had delved, there lay the dungeons and the pits, and here we must tread most softly of all, for these were the darkest places in all that dark house. In the deep vaults of Barad-dur, Sauron kept his prisoners and worked his cruelest arts, and it was into such a pit that captives were cast when the Dark Lord wished to wring from them their secrets, or simply to break them. Yet even here, dear listener, we need not linger in fear, for we are only distant watchers, and all of this is long ended, and it is a comfort to remember that even in the deepest pit of that tower the shadow did not have the final word, for it was from one such captivity, ages before, that a great truth was learned by the wise, and it was through the sufferings of a few brave prisoners that word of Sauron's designs came out into the world and was set against him, so that even the dungeons of Barad-dur, for all their cruelty, could not keep the light wholly out, nor prevent the slow turning of events that would one day bring the whole tower crashing down. Hold to that thought as we go, and let it soften all the shadow of this tale, that in every dark place there was a seed of its undoing, and that the tower, for all its dreadful strength, was never so secure as its master believed. Beyond the walls of the tower, all about its feet, stretched the plain of Gorgoroth, the innermost region of Mordor, a wide waste of ash and slag and broken stone lying between the dark tower and the burning mountain. And this too was part of the great design, for the plain was a place of mustering and of labor, dotted with the mines and the forges and the barren fields where the slaves of Mordor toiled to feed the endless armies of the enemy. Overhead the sky was seldom clear, for the reek of the mountain and the smoke of the forges hung always in the air, so that the sun, when it rose at all beyond that heavy pall, showed only as a dim and bleary redness, and the nights were lit not by clean starlight, but by the sullen glow of Orodruin and the far red gleam that burned at the tower's summit. It was a land, you might say, that had been wholly bent to a single purpose, every acre of it made to serve the will that dwelt in the tower, so that Mordor was not merely a country but a machine, and Barad-dur was the mind that governed it. And yet, even of this bleak land, we may speak with the gentleness of distance, for the winds that blow now over those old plains carry no more ash, and the fires of that mountain have long been quenched, and where once the forges roared, there is only silence, and the slow healing that time and rain and the turning of the seasons bring to even the most wounded of lands. Now that we have wandered its halls and looked upon its shape, let us turn back to the long history of the tower and follow it forward through the ages. For a fortress is not only stone and iron, but also the story of all that was done from within it, and all that at last was done to it. When Barad-dur was first raised, and Sauron sat within it with the one ring upon his hand, he was for a time triumphant, and his shadow spread far across the lands of Middle-earth. He put forth his power openly at last, and made war upon the elves who had discovered his deceit, and for a while it seemed that nothing could stand against him, for with the ring he was mightier than any single foe, and his armies were without number, and his tower was a threat that darkened every horizon. He overran wide lands, and cast down fair realms, and took many of the lesser rings of power for himself, giving some of them to men and to dwarves to bind them to his will. And it was in these years that the 9 men who received his rings began their long, slow fall into wraithdom, becoming in the end the ring-wraiths who would haunt his tower ever after. And for a long age the shadow lay heavy upon Middle-earth, and it seemed to many that the darkness would never lift. But the will of the West was not yet spent, and help came came out of the sea. For upon the great island of Númenor there dwelt a mighty race of men, tall and wise and long-lived, mariners without peer, and they had grown great in those years, and had begun to sail back to the shores of Middle-earth. And when they saw the tyranny of Sauron and the suffering of the peoples beneath his shadow, the greatest of their kings gathered a host and came against him. And so vast and so glorious was the might of Númenor at the height of its power that when its armada appeared upon the coasts and its host marched inland, the very servants of Sauron deserted him in fear, and his armies melted away. And for all his strength and all his ring, he found that he could not stand against the splendor of the men of the sea in open battle. Then Sauron, being ever cunning, bowed to necessity, and did a thing that was in keeping with his deepest nature. For he surrendered himself, and humbled himself, and allowed the king of Númenor to carry him away across the sea as a prisoner and a hostage. Yet this was no true defeat, but a deeper stratagem. For once within the island realm he set himself patiently and by soft degrees to corrupt it from within, whispering counsel into the ear of the king, turning the hearts of the Númenorians from the reverence of their fathers toward pride and fear of death, and at last toward open rebellion against the powers of the West. And in this he succeeded so terribly that he brought about the ruin of the whole island. For the king, beguiled by Sauron's counsel and mad with the fear of death, dared at last to sail against the very land of the powers themselves, seeking to seize deathlessness by force, and in answer the world was changed, and the great island of Númenor was drowned beneath the sea in a single catastrophe, and its glory was ended forever. And here is a wonder, and a thing that touches closely upon our tower, for in that great drowning Sauron's own body was destroyed. He had been within the island, or upon its shores, when the sea rose up, and the fair form that he had worn for so long, the guise of the Lord of Gifts, was unmade in the ruin. Yet Sauron himself did not perish, for so much of his being was now bound into the one ring that his spirit could not be so easily undone. And while the ring endured, he endured. His spirit fled back across the sea, back to the land of Mordor, back to the deep foundations of Barad-dur, where his power was rooted, and there, in the darkness, he clothed himself in a new body, a new form to house the malice that could not die. But he was never fair to look upon again after that drowning. The form he took thereafter was dark and terrible, and it is said that he could no longer wear a shape of beauty to deceive the eyes of men, for the ruin of Númenor had cost him that art forever. Henceforth he ruled by fear alone, and by the naked exercise of power, and the Dark Tower rose again to its full and dreadful height as the seat of a lord who could no longer pretend to be anything but what he was. Now there had escaped the drowning of Númenor a remnant of the faithful, those few among the men of the sea who had held true to the old reverence and had not followed the king into rebellion, and these came in their ships to the shores of Middle-earth and founded their realms in exile, kingdoms of the Númenorians in the mortal lands. And these exiled men were mighty still, and they were enemies of Sauron and of all his works, and their coming set the stage for the greatest reckoning that the Dark Tower would ever face in the elder days. For when Sauron had rebuilt his strength and moved once more to war, seeking to destroy these last kingdoms of his foes, the free peoples did a thing they had seldom done, and set aside their differences and joined their strength together. The elves and the men of the exiled realms made a great alliance, the last alliance it came to be called, a league of the two kindreds against the common shadow, and they gathered a host such as had not been seen since the wars of the elder days, and they marched into Mordor itself to make an end of the Dark Lord in his own land. And so there came to pass the great siege of Barad-dur, and it is one of the most storied events in all the history of Middle-earth, and it shows us both the strength of the tower and the limit of that strength. The host of the alliance came up onto the plain of Gorgoroth, into the very shadow of the tower, and there they set their siege, and it endured for long years, for the tower was mighty and could not easily be broken, and the servants of Sauron sallied forth again and again, and there was much grief and much valor upon that dreadful field. 7 years, it is said, the siege endured, 7 long years in which the host of the free peoples camped upon the ash of Gorgoroth, beneath the frowning walls, and cast down what they could, and were assailed in turn, and held their ground with a patience and a courage that outlasted all the malice of the enemy. And in all that time the tower itself could not be thrown down by any engine or any assault, for its foundations were bound with the power of the ring, and while the ring endured upon its master's hand, the black roots of Barad-dur held fast against every stroke. This is the heart of the matter, and it is worth holding on to as you drift. The tower could not be destroyed from without so long as the ring endured, and so the only way to end it was to come at its master directly, and to unmake the source of its strength. At the last, when the long siege had worn on, and neither side could gain the mastery, Sauron himself came forth from his tower to do battle, for he perceived that the will of his enemies would not break, and that the matter must be settled by his own hand. And it is told that the greatest of the elven kings and the greatest of the men of the exiled realms stood against him, the high king of the elves, and the lord of the men of the west together. And there upon the slopes beneath the tower there was a duel of powers such as the world has seldom seen, and in that dreadful meeting both of those great lords were slain. For even in his lessened state Sauron was terrible beyond the strength of any single champion, and it seemed for a moment that the darkness would prevail even at the very gates of its own undoing. Yet the Dark Lord did not go unscathed, for he too was overthrown in that struggle, cast down upon the ash, and in that instant of his fall the son of the slain Lord of Men, a warrior named Isildur, took up the broken shard of his father's sword, the blade that had shattered even as its wielder fell, and with that jagged remnant he struck at the hand of the fallen enemy, and cut from it the finger that bore the one ring. And in that moment, dear listener, the whole vast edifice of Sauron's power reeled, for the ring in which he had hidden so much of himself was cut away from him, and his spirit, robbed of the body that had housed it and of the hand that had worn the ring, could not maintain its form. His shape was destroyed, and his spirit fled, shrieking away, a formless shadow, out of Mordor and into the wild places of the world, where it lay for long ages, powerless and diminished, unable to take shape again, waiting and gathering the shreds of its strength in the dark. And with the fall of its master and the loss of the ring from his hand, the Dark Tower could no longer stand as it had stood. Its walls were cast down, its battlements broken, its towers thrown to the ground, and the great fortress that no engine could breach while the ring was worn was at last brought low, for the will that sustained it was fled. So Barad-dur, the mightiest work of malice ever raised in Middle-earth, was overthrown in the hour of its master's defeat, and the host of the last alliance stood victorious amid the ruin, and it seemed to many in that hour that the shadow was ended forever and that the world had been set free. Yet here is the deep and fateful thing, the hinge upon which the whole later history would turn, and it is worth speaking of slowly, for it explains why the tower would one day rise again. The foundations of Barad-dur were not destroyed, its upper works were cast down, its visible strength was broken and scattered, but the deep roots that Sauron had delved and bound with the power of the ring could not be unmade by the hands of his enemies, for that same power still existed in the world. The ring had not been destroyed, it had only been cut from its master's hand, and there was one place, and one place only, where the ring could have been unmade, and that was the fire in which it had been forged, the flames at the roots of the burning mountain from whose heat it had come. And Isildur, who had taken the ring, was counselled by the wise to cast it into that fire while he stood so near to it, to make an end of it forever, while the chance was his. But he would not, for the ring was beautiful to him, and it was precious, and it seemed to him a fitting recompense for the death of his father and his kin. And so he kept it, and bore it away, and would not destroy it. And in that refusal lay the seed of all the sorrows to come. For while the ring endured, its master was not truly dead, and while its master was not truly dead, the foundations of his tower waited in the ruined land, patient as the roots of a felled tree that is not yet grubbed up, ready to send forth new growth whenever the sustaining will should return. So the ring passed out of the reckoning of the wise, for Isildur bore it away, and not long after he was slain, and the ring slipped from his hand, as he fled through a river, and it sank into the deep water, and was lost, and for long ages none knew where it had gone. And the shadow of Sauron faded from the world, and Mordor lay empty and desolate, its plains untended, its forges cold, its tower a broken ruin of black stone upon the shoulder of the mountains. And the long years passed, and the exiled kingdoms of men rose and flourished, and in time began to wane, and the elves dwindled and departed slowly into the west, and the world moved on, and the memory of the Dark Tower faded into old song and half-forgotten fear. And for a while, a long while, measured in the lives of men many generations, there was something like peace in the eastern lands, and the ash of Gorgoroth lay quiet beneath the empty sky, and the ruins of Barad-dur stood silent, and no red eye burned at their summit. And it might have seemed to any traveller who dared those roads that the shadow was gone from the world forever, and would trouble it no more. But it was not so, and here is where our tale takes its turn, back toward the tower's second and darker flowering, and we must follow the slow return of the shadow. For Sauron's spirit had not perished, and through the long, empty years it crept back, little by little, gathering strength, until at last it could take shape once more, though a lesser and a fouler shape than before. And when it had gathered enough of its old power to move again in the world, it did not at first return openly to Mordor, for Sauron was cunning, and he feared the watchfulness of his old enemies, and he knew that if he showed himself too soon, he might be assailed again before he was ready. So he went instead into a great forest, far to the north and west, into a hidden fastness beneath the eaves of the woods, and there he raised a lesser stronghold, and hid himself, and worked his designs in secret, and put on a disguise, so that even the wise who marked the growing darkness in that place did not at first know what dwelt there. They named the shadow the Necromancer, for its power was a power over fear and over the dead and the wraith-ridden, and they didn't guess, not for a long while, that this hidden sorcerer was none other than the ancient enemy himself, returning by stealth to the world. And all the while, in the far east, the empty ruins of Barad-dur waited upon their black hill, and the deep foundations that could not be unmade lay quiet in the desolate land, biding their time, ready for the day when their master should return to raise the tower up once more. For long years the wise of Middle-earth watched the growing shadow in that northern forest with unease, and could not be sure of its nature, and there was much debate among them as to what should be done. A council of the great was formed, the White Council it was called, a gathering of the mightiest of the elves and of the wizards who had come into the world to contend against the darkness, and they met and took counsel together over many years concerning the shadow in the wood. And one among the wizards, the wisest and most watchful of them, long suspected that the necromancer was in truth Sauron returned, and urged that he be assailed and driven out before he could grow too strong. But others counselled caution and delay, and so for a long time nothing decisive was done, and the shadow grew. There came at last a day when that wise wizard went secretly into the very dungeons of the northern stronghold to learn the truth, and there he found a captive who confirmed his darkest fears, and he came away certain at last that the necromancer was Sauron, and that the ancient enemy was indeed returning to the world. And upon his urging, the council roused itself at last, and put forth its strength, and drove the shadow out of the forest fastness. But it was too late to catch the enemy unprepared, for Sauron had foreseen the assault, and had already made his plans, and he only feigned to be driven forth in defeat. For the truth, which the wise soon learned to their sorrow, was that Sauron had chosen his hour, and that being driven from his hidden refuge suited his own designs, for he had resolved that the time had come to return openly to his ancient seat. And so, in that very age, the Dark Lord went back at last to Mordor, back to the black land ringed with mountains, back to the shoulder of rock where the ruins of his old fortress waited, and there he set his will once more upon the deep foundations that had never been unmade, and began to raise the Dark Tower up again from its roots. And because the foundations still held the ancient power, and because the ring, though lost, still existed somewhere in the world and still bound its scattered strength to its master's will, the tower could be built anew upon its old and unbroken base, rising once more tier upon tier into the smoky heaven, black and grim and terrible as it had been of old. It is a chilling thing to consider, and yet from our safe distance we may consider it calmly, that the great labor of the last alliance, the 7 years of siege and the death of kings, had not sufficed to end the tower forever, precisely because the ring had not been destroyed, and that the only true and final undoing of Barad-dur could ever come through the unmaking of that small circle of gold in the fire from which it was born. All else was but delay. The wise came to understand this in time, and it shaped all their counsels thereafter, and it is the thread that runs through the whole of the great tale that was to come. So the tower rose again, and this time, at its summit, there appeared the sign by which it is most often remembered, the dreadful token of the watchfulness of its master, the eye. For Sauron in this later age did not walk abroad in a fair form, as once he had, nor even often in any bodily shape that his servants might look upon. Rather, his presence was felt as a searching, sleepless will, and its visible sign was a great eye rimmed with fire, lidless and red, that seemed to watch out from the topmost window of the Dark Tower over all the land about. Whether this eye was a thing of flame set in the high chamber, or a shape seen by the spirit rather than the body, or a symbol of the reach of Sauron's thought, the tales tell in different ways, but all agree that to feel the attention of that eye turned toward one was among the most dreadful of all experiences, a cold and crushing pressure of malice, a sense of being sought out and stripped bare beneath a gaze from which nothing could be hidden. And so the rebuilt tower was crowned with that red and terrible light which could be seen from far across the plain of Gorgoroth, a beacon of fear answering across the dark to the glow of the burning mountain, the two of them together making a lurid and restless twilight in which the servants of the enemy went about their labors. Yet even this, dear listener, we may look upon without dread, for the eye is long closed, and the light is long quenched, and the window at the tower's summit looks out now upon nothing at all, for the tower itself is gone, and all the fear it once inspired has drained away into the past, like water into thirsty sand, leaving only the memory which cannot harm us, and the wonder which is our own. And so, in the last age of its standing, Barad-dur reached the height of its dreadful glory, greater and more terrible perhaps than it had ever been before, for Sauron had learned much in his long defeats, and he built now with a colder and a more patient cunning. The tower stood complete once more, its deep foundations bound with old power, its high tiers climbing black into the ashen sky, its forges roaring in the deeps, its barracks filled with a multitude of orcs, and its high halls haunted by the Nine, and above it all the Red Eye keeping its sleepless watch. And the whole land of Mordor was ordered anew to serve it. The mines reopened, the fields of slaves set once more to their bitter labor, the passes guarded, the borders watched, the great gate of the land raised up and fortified against any who might dare to enter. It was in those final years the very image of an unassailable power, a fortress that seemed to declare to all the world that the shadow had returned to stay, and that nothing now could ever cast it down. And yet, and this is the sweet and secret irony at the heart of the whole tale, the mightier the tower grew, the more utterly its fate hung upon a single small and hidden thing. For all its towering strength rested still upon the endurance of the ring, and the ring was no longer in its master's keeping, but was wandering, lost and found and lost again, out in the wide world, drawing nearer by slow and secret ways to the one road that could bring the whole vast edifice crashing down. The tower did not know its own peril. It stood in its pride, watchful and terrible, and never guessed that its undoing was already creeping toward the mountain in the hands of the small and the humble. Now a great tower does not stand alone, and if we are to understand all that lay within and about Barad-dur, we must look also to the outer works that guarded the approaches to it, the lesser fortresses and the grim gates that made the whole land of Mordor into a single vast defense with the Dark Tower at its center. For Sauron, being ever the careful craftsman, had ringed his land not only with the natural walls of its mountains, but with fortifications of his own devising at every point where an enemy might seek to enter, so that to come at the tower at all, one must first pass through a gauntlet of dread. And chief among these outer defenses was the great gate at the northwestern corner of the land, where the two mountain ranges drew near together and left a narrow opening onto the plains beyond. There Sauron had built a barrier of enormous strength, a rampart and a wall flung across the gap, with a gate of iron and towers of watch. And this was called the Black Gate, the Morannon, the very mouth of Mordor. 2 towers of stone stood upon either side of it, tall and cunningly wrought, and they were called the Towers of the Teeth, for they stood up like fangs guarding the entrance, ever manned, ever watchful, so that no host could hope to force that gate without a great and costly battle. And behind the gate lay the road that led inward toward the plain of Gorgoroth and the Dark Tower beyond, so that the Morannon was in a sense the outermost defense of Barad-dur itself, the first and the strongest of the doors that shut the Shadowland against the world. Yet the Black Gate was not the only way into Mordor, and it was not the way by which the tower's fate would come, for away to the west, in the mountains of shadow that walled the land upon that side, there was another and a secret pass, higher and more dreadful, and it too was guarded, though by an older and a stranger watch. And here we come to another of the fortresses bound up with the story of the Dark Tower, a place with a history of its own that is worth the telling. For in that western range there stood a city that had not always belonged to the shadow. In the days when the exiled men of the sea were mighty, they had built 2 great towered cities to guard the land on either side of the river that ran through their realm, sister cities, fair and strong, and one of these had stood upon the very edge of the mountains that would later become the western wall of Mordor. It had been a city of light in its beginning, white-towered and beautiful, a watchtower of the men of the West, set to keep guard against the evil that lingered in the empty land beyond. But in the long, slow waning of those kingdoms, the city fell and was taken by the servants of the shadow, and the ring-wraiths themselves came to dwell in it, and it was changed utterly from a tower of light into a tower of dread. Its fair name was cast down, and it was called thereafter Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and a pale and corpse-like light shone from it in the dark, a light more horrible than any blackness, and none who valued their reason willingly drew near its haunted walls. Thus you may see how the shadow worked, dear listener, for it did not only build, it took, and it corrupted, and it turned the fair works of others to its own foul ends. The white tower of the men of the West became the green-lit fortress of the Wraiths, a sister and a servant to Barad-dur, guarding the western approaches and housing the most terrible of Sauron's lieutenants, the Lord of the Nine, the fell captain, who had once been a king among men. And above that haunted city, higher in the mountains, there wound a secret stair and a narrow cleft, a hidden pass over the range and down into Mordor. And this pass, too, was guarded, for at its inner end there stood yet another watchtower, a fortress of the enemy set to keep the back door of his land. This was the tower that guarded the high pass, and it was a place of orcs and cruelty, and near it, in the dark tunnels beneath the mountains, there lurked an ancient horror, a great and monstrous spinner of webs, a creature of hunger, older than Sauron's dominion, whom the Dark Lord suffered to dwell there because she served, in her blind and greedy way, as one more guard upon the road, devouring any who sought to creep into Mordor by that secret way. And so the whole land was sealed, gate and pass and mountain wall, with the Dark Tower brooding at the heart of it all. And it seemed that no one, whether host or spy or thief, could ever hope to pass all those defenses and come at last unmarked to the fire of the mountain. This was the confidence of the shadow, and it was very nearly justified, and yet it was through that very secret pass, past the haunted city and the guarding tower and the lurking horror in the dark, that the small and the humble would at last come creeping toward the mountain, unlooked for and unregarded, carrying in their keeping the one thing that could bring the whole vast fortress of the land to ruin. It is worth our while to dwell a moment on how the tower looked upon the wider world, and how the wider world looked upon the tower, for this too is part of understanding what Barad-dur was. To the peoples of the free lands, in the last age of its standing, the Dark Tower was less a place than a presence, a weight upon the edge of thought, a rumor of dread that lay behind every ill tiding and every gathering storm. Few had ever seen it, and fewer still had seen it and returned. It stood far off in a forbidden land, behind its wall of mountains, and most who spoke of it spoke from hearsay and old fear. Yet its influence reached out across all the lands, in the movements of its armies, in the spreading of its spies, in the slow corruption of hearts, near and far, so that even those who had never looked upon its black tears lived always in some measure beneath its shadow. And this, in a way, was the tower's greatest strength, greater even than its walls, that it ruled by fear, and that fear travels far and needs no army to carry it. The mere knowledge that the eye was watching, that the tower stood, that the shadow had returned, and was gathering its strength, was enough to sap the courage of many and to make them despair before ever a blow was struck. This is a thing worth remembering, for it tells us something true about all shadows, that much of their power lies not in what they can do, but in what we fear they can do. And it tells us also why the small deeds of a few brave and humble hearts, done far from any battlefield, in secret and against all hope, could matter so much in the end. For the tower's strength was fear, and fear is undone by courage, even the quiet courage of those who go on putting one foot before the other when all hope seems lost. Let us turn now to the hosts that the tower sheltered and sent forth, for a fortress is measured also by the strength it holds, and Barad-dur in its last age held a strength beyond all reckoning. Within its walls and upon the plains beneath it there gathered a multitude of the servants of the shadow, and chief among these in number were the orcs, that unhappy and misbegotten people, bred and driven and used as the tools of the enemy's will. They swarmed in the deep places of the tower, and in the tunnels of the mountains, and in the barren fields of Gorgoroth, a teeming host, armed from the endless forges, ordered by cruel captains, held together by fear and by hatred, for they feared their master more than they feared any foe, and they hated all things fair and living, having been made wretched themselves. And with them there were other and worse creatures, great trolls of stone-like hide, strong enough to bear down gates and to hurl down walls, and beasts of prey trained to the hunt of men, and the fell, winged steeds upon which the ring-wraiths rode in the later days, dreadful shapes out of an elder darkness. And men, too, alas, for Sauron had gathered to his banner many peoples of the east and the south, tribes and kingdoms of men who had fallen under his sway or been bought by his promises or terrified into his service, so that the host of Mordor was swelled by mortal armies as well as by the bred legions of the orcs. All of these the tower held and marshalled and sent forth at need, so that when at last the Dark Lord judged his hour to have come, he could pour out of his gates an army such as the world had not seen since the wars of the elder days. Imagine yourself, if your drowsy mind will bear it gently for a moment, standing high and safe above the plain of Gorgoroth in the hour of the great mustering, looking down as a bird might look, untouched and unafraid, upon the vast dark movement below. See the fires of the forges glaring red in the deep dusk, and the long lines of marching figures winding out from the feet of the tower like dark rivers, and the banners black against the sullen sky, and hear the deep, slow throb of drums beating time to the tramp of numberless feet, and the harsh cries of the captains, and the clangor of iron, all of it rising up together into a great low roar, like the roar of a distant sea. It is a fearful sight, and yet from your safe height it is also strangely far away, a pageant of shadow spread out beneath you like a moving map, and you may watch it as one watches a storm rolling across a valley from a high and sheltered place, feeling the awe of it but none of the danger, and then let it grow small and dim and distant as your thoughts begin to drift. Let the roar fade to a murmur, and the murmur to a whisper, and the whisper to the soft sound of your own slow breathing in the quiet dark of your room, for all of that great host is long since gone to dust, and the plain where it mustered is empty now, and the silence that has fallen there is deep and clean and everlasting. Now the long peace of the world, such as it was, came to its end when the One Ring was found again after all its long ages of loss. For the ring, which had sunk into the deep water when Isildur was slain, had not stayed hidden forever. It had come by strange and secret ways into the keeping of a small and wretched creature, and had lain long with him in the dark under the mountains, and had at last been found and carried away, by chance as it seemed, though the wise came to feel that no chance was truly at work in it, into the keeping of one of the small folk of a quiet green country far away. And little by little the enemy learned that his ring was in the world again, and that it had come into the hands of a people he had scarcely heard of, and a great desire and a great fear awoke in him, for he knew that if he could but recover the ring, he would be mightier than ever before, and his victory would be assured. And he knew, too, that if his enemies should find it first, and dare to destroy it, then he himself and all his works would fall. And so from the Dark Tower there went forth a search, patient and terrible, and the most dreadful of all his servants were sent out upon it. The Nine, the ring-wraiths, rode out from the land of shadow, crossing the borders of Mordor, and passing swiftly and secretly through the wide lands beyond, seeking the country of the small folk and the keeper of the ring, spreading dread before them wherever they went, hunting with a will that never tired and a hatred that never slept. And thus the shadow of the tower stretched out at last across all the western lands, and the quiet places of the world felt the cold breath of Mordor upon them, and the great struggle for the ring began. And here we might pause in the hush to consider the strange and hidden logic of the whole affair, for it is a thing full of wonder. The Dark Lord in his tower sought the ring in order to complete his power and to make his dominion unbreakable. But the wise among his enemies, when they came to understand the truth, perceived that they could never hope to use the ring against him, for it was his own, made to his own hand, and any who wielded it would only become in the end another Dark Lord in his place. And they perceived too that they could never keep it safe from him forever, for he would never cease to seek it, and in the end he would find it. And so they came to a conclusion so daring and so contrary to all the wisdom of war, that it must have seemed to many like madness, that the only hope was neither to use the ring nor to hide it, but to destroy it, to carry it into the very heart of the enemy's own land, past all his defenses, up to the fire of the mountain where alone it could be unmade, and there to cast it into the flames. It was the one thing the Dark Lord would never expect, for it was the one thing that no lover of power would ever do. He could not conceive that his enemies, having his ring in their hands, would seek not to wield it but to throw it away. And it was in that blind spot, that failure of the shadow to imagine the possibility of its own renunciation, that the one slender hope of all the free peoples was to be found. The tower watched for armies and for champions and for a rival wielder of the ring. It never thought to watch the empty roads for two small and weary travelers creeping toward the mountain with the intent to give up power rather than to seize it. Let us return now in our slow wandering to the question that lies at the very heart of our tale, and ask again what secret things the Dark Tower held within it in that last age. For beyond its armies and its forges and its dungeons, there were kept in Barad-dur certain hidden things of great power and great peril, and of these we should speak. For Sauron was a gatherer of knowledge and of instruments of power, and among the treasures he had taken to himself over the long ages, there was one of especial worth, a thing that gave him a reach and a sight far beyond the walls of his tower. In the elder days, when the men of the sea were mighty, they had brought with them out of the west 7 wondrous stones, seeing stones, orbs of dark crystal that were linked one to another, so that one who looked into a stone might see across great distances, and might behold what was shown in the others, and might even, if his will were strong enough, speak mind to mind with another who gazed into a far stone. These were the Palantiri, the stones of seeing, and they had been set in the towers and high places of the exiled kingdoms, and used for the governance and the guarding of those realms. But in the long waning of the kingdoms, some of the stones were lost, and some were hidden, and one of them, the stone that had been set in the fair white tower of the eastern city, passed into the shadow, when that city fell and became Minas Morgul, and so came at last into the hands of Sauron himself, and was carried to Barad-dur, and kept there in the high places of the tower. And with that stone in his keeping, dear listener, the Dark Lord gained a dreadful advantage, for the stones were linked, and he who held one could reach out to whoever might dare to look into another, and could bend the weaker will to his own. In the topmost chamber of the tower, then, there was kept this orb of seeing, and through it Sauron looked out upon the world, and worse, through it he drew others into his snare, for there were other stones yet surviving in the towers of his enemies, and when the proud or the curious among them looked into their stones, thinking to spy out the doings of the shadow or to gather knowledge for the war, they found instead that a greater will was waiting on the other side, and that the stone that should have served them had become a door through which the enemy could enter. In this way, it is told, One of the wizards who had come into the world to oppose the shadow was himself ensnared and turned, for he looked too often and too boldly into a stone that his fortress held, and little by little the Dark Lord read his heart and fed his pride and bent him to a secret servitude, until the wizard who had been set to fight the shadow became instead its unwitting instrument. And so the seeing stone in the high chamber of Barad-dur was among the most perilous of all the tower's hidden things, a window through which the master of the tower could reach out invisibly across all the miles of the world and lay his cold hand upon the minds of the unwary. It is a strange and a fearful secret, and yet, like all the rest, it is long undone, for the tower is fallen and the stone is lost, and no will waits any longer on the other side of the dark glass. And there were other secrets in the deep places of the tower, things of lore and of malice gathered over the ages, the knowledge of the making of the rings and the arts of deceit and of dominion, and the long memory of a spirit that had been in the world since before the raising of the mountains and the kindling of the stars. For remember that Sauron was no mere warlord, but an ancient and a mighty spirit, wise with a wisdom bent wholly to evil ends, and the tower was in a sense the storehouse of all that he had learned and gathered in his long and terrible existence. In its vaults, we may imagine, lay the accumulated instruments of his craft, the tools of his sorcery, the records of his dominion, the tribute and the plunder of the peoples he had subdued, and over all of it brooded the sleepless will of its master, ordering and remembering and desiring, forever reaching outward toward the one thing it lacked and most craved, which was the ring, and forever unaware that the ring was creeping toward it, not in triumph but in ruin. There is something almost pitiable in it when one considers it from the safe distance of the ages, all that gathered power and knowledge and craft, all that vast and patient malice, all bent upon a single object, and all of it resting upon a foundation that a single act of humble courage far away would one day be enough to sweep utterly from the world. Climb with me once more in the gentlest of imaginings, up to the very summit of the tower, to the high chamber beneath the eye, the innermost and the loftiest of all its secret places, where the will of the Dark Lord was most present and most concentrated. It was a cold place, we may suppose, and a still one, high above the roar of the forges and the tramp of the armies, a place of watching and of thought, from whose narrow windows one might look out over the whole of the Shadowland, over the plain of Gorgoroth and the burning mountain and the far mountain walls, and beyond them, in the mind's reach, over all the lands of Middle-earth. And here, in this high and terrible solitude, the Dark Lord kept his watch, and wove his designs, and reached out with his will across the world. And here, above all, burned the sign of his presence, the great red eye, sleepless and searching, the visible token of a will that never rested and never turned aside from its desire. To stand in that chamber, had any friend of the free peoples been able to do so, and to live, would have been to stand at the very center and source of the shadow, at the point from which all the darkness of that age flowed outward. And it is a strange thought and a comforting one that the highest and most dreadful chamber of the mightiest fortress ever raised by malice stood empty and silent within a few short hours of the ring's unmaking, its eye put out, its watching ended, its long vigil broken forever. But we run ahead of our tale, for the ring has not yet come to the mountain, and there is more to tell of how it made its slow and secret way toward the fire, and of how the tower, all unknowing, watched the wrong roads while its doom drew near. Now the hour came at last when the Dark Lord judged that his strength was gathered and that he might strike openly for the mastery of the world, and in that hour the tower tower poured forth its might, and all the long labor of the forges and the mustering yards was loosed upon the free peoples in a great tide of war. From the Black Gate in the north and from the haunted city in the west, the armies of Mordor issued forth, hosts beyond counting, orcs and men and trolls and the fell captains of the Nine, marching out under black banners to break the last kingdoms that stood against the shadow. And the chief stroke was aimed at the great city of the men of the west, the last and proudest of the strongholds of Sauron's oldest enemies, a white-towered city built upon the knees of the mountains which had kept watch against Mordor for long ages, and which the Dark Lord most desired to cast down. Against that city the Lord of the Nine led a mighty host and laid siege to it, and there was a great battle beneath its walls, one of the greatest of that or any age, in which the fate of the western world seemed to hang in the balance. And all of this, though it lies a little apart from the tower itself, is part of the tower's story, for it was the tower's strength that marched in those armies, and it was the tower's will that drove them, and it was the tower's master who watched the battle from afar through his seeing stone and his sleepless thought, bending all his attention upon the war in the west. And herein, dear listener, lay the working of the hidden plan, and it is a thing of quiet beauty amid all the clamor of the war. For the wise among the free peoples knew that they could not defeat Sauron by force of arms. His strength was too great, his armies too many, his tower too strong. Their battles, however valiant, could only delay the end, not prevent it. But they knew also that all their hope rested upon the secret errand of the ring, upon the two small travelers creeping toward the mountain, and that the one thing most needful was that the eye of the tower should be kept turned outward, toward the war, toward the armies and the champions and the visible struggle, and away from the empty roads of Mordor, where the true danger crept unseen. And so they resolved to give the Dark Lord a war, to draw his gaze and his strength and his fear toward themselves, to make so bold and so threatening a show of resistance that he would never think to look behind him at the small and secret thing stealing toward the fire. It was a strategy of magnificent and deliberate sacrifice, an offering of themselves as a lure that the true stroke might go unnoticed. And it worked in the end precisely because it played upon the one great blindness of the shadow, its inability to imagine that its enemies might seek to destroy the ring rather than to seize it. The tower watched the armies, the tower watched the champions, the tower never watched the road to the mountain until it was far, far too late. So the war raged in the west, and the great city was beset, and there was fire and terror and the clash of vast hosts beneath its walls. And though the defenders were sorely pressed, and came very near to ruin, yet in the end the tide was turned, for help came at need from unlooked-for quarters, and the Lord of the Nine was overthrown upon the field, cast down at last after all his ages of dread by the courage of those he had thought too weak to harm him. And the armies of Mordor were broken before the city and driven back, and the first great stroke of the shadow failed. Yet Sauron was not thereby defeated, for his strength was very great, and the loss of one army, however mighty, could not undo him. He had more hosts and more captains, and his tower still stood, and his will was undimmed, and so the war was not ended but only checked, and the leaders of the free peoples, gathered in the captured field before the rescued city, took counsel together as to what should be done next, knowing that their victory, though real, had bought them only a little time, and that the shadow would soon gather itself for another and a greater stroke. And it was then that the wise among them resolved upon the last and most desperate part of their design, a stroke of pure and calculated boldness, meant not to win the war, but to buy time and safety for the secret errand upon which all truly depended. They knew that the ring-bearer, if he yet lived, was even then within the land of Mordor, creeping toward the mountain, and they knew that his greatest peril was not the armies but the eye, the searching will of the tower that might at any moment turn inward and perceive him. And so they conceived a plan to hold that eye fixed elsewhere, to draw the whole attention of the Dark Lord outward one last time, and to keep it there through the fateful hours, whatever the cost to themselves. They would march with what strength remained to them, a strength pitifully small beside the might of Mordor, straight to the Black Gate itself, to the very threshold of the Shadowland, and there they would challenge the Dark Lord to open battle, offering themselves up as bait, daring him to come out and destroy them. It was a march that few of them expected to survive, an act of deliberate and open sacrifice, and yet they undertook it gladly, or as gladly as brave hearts may undertake what is likely to be their death, because they understood that by drawing the eye to the gate, they might give the two small travelers within the land the shadow of a chance to reach the fire unseen. And so the last host of the free peoples set out toward Mordor, toward the very jaws of the enemy, to make of themselves a lure and a distraction, that the true and secret hope might have its hour. But let us leave the gate and the marching host for a while, and follow instead the two small travelers within the land, for it is their slow and secret journey that brings us closest of all to the foot of the Dark Tower, and lets us look upon it, at the last, not from far off, but from the very plain of Gorgoroth beneath its walls. For the ring-bearer and his faithful companion had passed by then over the mountain wall, up the secret stair, and through the high cleft and past the guarding tower, and had come down at last into the Black Land itself, into the innermost region of the shadow, and there they went on foot across the desolate plain toward the burning mountain, and all the while the Dark Tower stood before them and to their side, black and vast upon its shoulder of rock, crowned with its red and sleepless eye. Imagine, if you will, from your safe and drowsy distance, what it must have been to walk that plain, the ground underfoot cracked and grey with ash, strewn with slag and cinder and the broken refuse of the forges, no green thing growing, no clean water running, the air heavy and bitter and hard to breathe, and overhead the low sky choked with drifting smoke, lit from beneath by the sullen glow of the mountain, and from afar by the red gleam of the tower, so that all the land lay in a dim and shifting twilight, neither day nor night, and over it all, dominating every horizon, unavoidable to the eye and heavy upon the heart, rose Barad-dûr, so great that it seemed less a building than a black mountain reared by hands, its tiers climbing up and up into the murk, its topmost pinnacle lost in the reek, and at its summit the burning eye from which the travellers must forever hide, keeping to the hollows and the shadows and the folds of the broken ground, lest its gaze should fall upon them. It was, we are told, a journey of terrible weariness and terrible peril, and the nearer the travellers drew to the tower and the mountain, the heavier grew the burden that the ring-bearer carried, for the ring waxed in weight and in malice as it came closer to the place of its making and to the seat of its master. It seemed to drag at his neck like a millstone, and to fill his mind with the pressure of the shadow, and to make each step harder than the last, so that at the end he could scarcely walk, and had to be helped and half carried by his companion, that humble and steadfast friend whose love and stubborn courage carried them both through when hope and strength alike had failed. And yet, dear listener, even in the very heart of the Shadowland, beneath the walls of the Dark Tower itself, the light was not wholly quenched, for it is told that once, in the depth of that dreadful journey, the faithful companion looked up from the darkness and the ash, and saw, far above the reek and the murk of Mordor, a single white star shining in a rift of the clouds, and the beauty of it smote his heart, and he understood in that moment that the shadow was only a small and passing thing, and that there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach, and that the darkness of Mordor, for all its vastness, could not touch the things that were truly precious. And that thought put heart into him again, And he went on, "Hold to that image, if you like, as you drift towards sleep, the small, weary traveler in the black land, looking up past the very tower of the enemy to a clean white star burning in the far heaven, and taking comfort from it, and going on. For it is the truest thing in all this tale that no shadow, however great, can put out the stars. Consider, too, that the tower's greatest strength was in that very hour becoming its greatest blindness, for the whole vast machinery of Mordor, all its watchfulness and all its power was turned outward toward the war, toward the host that even then was marching to the Black Gate, and inward toward the plain the eye scarcely looked at all. It never occurred to the master of the tower that anything of moment could be creeping across his own barren fields. His gaze swept the borders and the passes and the distant lands, seeking armies and champions, and passed clean over the two ragged and starving figures toiling across the ash, almost beneath his windows. And so it was that the very greatness of the tower, the very completeness of its dominion, became the cloak under which its doom approached. For a lord so mighty could not stoop to imagine that his ruin might come in so small and so humble a guise, and it was exactly in the gap left by that pride that the last hope of the world found room to move. There is a lesson in this that is worth carrying gently into sleep, that the mighty are most often undone, not by a greater might, but by the one small thing they were too proud to notice, and that the humble and the overlooked, precisely because they are humble and overlooked, may sometimes carry a weight of destiny that no fortress and no army could ever have borne. And so the travelers came at last to the roots of the burning mountain, and began the final and most terrible stage of their journey, the long, slow climb up the mountain side toward the fire that burned within it, the one fire in all the world in which the ring could be unmade. And every step of that climb was a labor beyond telling, for the burden had grown almost past bearing, and the will of the ring, so near now to the seat of its power, fought against its bearer with all its cunning, whispering to him, dragging at him, seeking by every art to turn him aside from the fire. It was, in truth, less a battle of the body than of the spirit, a struggle in the deepest places of the heart, between the desire to cast the burden into the flames and the desire, waxing ever stronger the nearer they came, to keep it and to claim it and to wield it. And the tower, all this while, watched the wrong horizon and knew nothing of the small figures creeping up the mountain that stood almost within sight of its own black walls, until the very last moment, when it was already too late for anything the shadow could do to save itself. Now let us return to the Black Gate, where the last host of the free peoples had come, a small array indeed beside the might of Mordor, and had halted before the great iron doors and the frowning towers of the Teeth, to make their challenge and to draw the eye of the tower upon themselves. And it is told that before the battle was joined, there came out from the gate an emissary of the Dark Lord, a fell and cruel figure, the mouth and herald of Sauron, who spoke words of scorn and of threat, and who showed to the leaders of the host certain tokens, a small coat of bright mail, and a grey cloak, and other things that had belonged to one of the travellers, as though to say that the ring-bearer was taken, and his errand failed, and all their hope was vain. And a cold dread fell upon the hearts of the captains when they saw those tokens, for they feared that all was indeed lost, that their friend was captured or slain, and the ring even now in the hands of the enemy. Yet they did not yield, for they had come knowing they might not return, and they had resolved to stand whatever befell. And so they refused the terms of the herald, and cast his threats back in his teeth, and prepared to sell their lives dearly upon that dreadful threshold. And the gates of Mordor opened, and the hosts of the shadow poured out, and the small array of the free peoples was surrounded upon the slag hills before the gate, hemmed in on every side by a multitude beyond counting, and the last battle was joined beneath the very walls of the enemy's land, and it is worth our while to pause here in the hush and to marvel at the courage of it, for those who stood in that battle did not stand in hope of victory. They knew that they could not defeat the armies of Mordor by strength. They knew that their small host must in all likelihood be overwhelmed and destroyed. They knew that they had come there not to win, but to draw the eye and to buy time, to hold the attention of the shadow fixed upon the gate for as long as their lives should last, that the secret errand might have its chance. They fought, in other words, not for themselves, but for a hope they could not see and might never live to know the outcome of, a hope resting entirely upon two small figures somewhere within the land, of whose fate they had no certain word. And there is something in that, dear listener, so noble and so quietly moving that it is worth carrying with you into the softness of sleep. The picture of a small band of the free and the good, ringed about by an overwhelming darkness, standing firm not because they thought they would prevail, but because they had chosen to give whatever they had, even their lives, for the sake of a hope that lay in other and humbler hands. For the greatest deeds are often done in just this way, without certainty, without the promise of reward, in the simple resolve to stand fast, and to do what one can, and to leave the rest to fortune and to the courage of others. So the battle raged before the gate, and the host of the west was pressed hard, and the shadow of Mordor gathered thick above them, and to any eye that looked upon that field it must have seemed that the end had come, and that the darkness would swallow the last defenders of the free world. The eye of the tower was turned wholly upon the gate, upon the battle, upon the champions and the banners, and the desperate stand of its enemies. The whole will of Sauron was bent outward, gloating, certain of victory, savouring the destruction of the last army that dared oppose him. He had drawn out his foes and surrounded them, and it seemed that nothing could save them. And in his triumph he thought of nothing but the battle before his gate. And that, precisely that, was the moment for which the whole design had waited. For while the eye gazed outward at the gate, drunk with the nearness of its triumph, the true stroke was falling far away and unregarded upon the mountain that stood within his own land. The tower, in the very hour that it seemed most certain of its victory, was in fact standing at the brink of its utter and final ruin, and did not know it. All its watchfulness was spent upon the wrong place. All its strength was gathered against the wrong enemy, and the small and humble thing it had never thought to fear was even then coming to the fire. For at that same hour, upon the mountain, the two travelers had reached the very chamber of fire within the burning mountain, the place where alone the ring could be destroyed, and there the last and hardest part of the whole long tale was played out. And it did not go as any might have wished or expected, for at the very end, upon the brink of the fire, with the whole errand come down to a single act, the will of the ring proved too strong for its bearer, and he could not bring himself to cast it away. After all his suffering, after carrying the burden across so many weary miles, after enduring so much, at the last moment he claimed it for his own, and would not destroy it. And it seemed, for one dreadful instant, that all was lost, that the errand had failed at the very threshold of its accomplishment, that the courage and the sacrifice of so many had come to nothing. But Providence, or fate, or the strange workings of mercy had woven the tale otherwise, and the ring was unmade after all, though not by any hand that willed it. For there was another, a wretched and ruined creature who had followed the travelers all that long way, consumed by his craving for the ring, and in the struggle that followed upon the brink of the fire, it was he who seized it at the last, and in his blind greed and his triumph he stumbled and fell, and the ring went with him into the fire. And so the thing was done, not gloriously, not cleanly, but done nonetheless. The ring fell into the flames from which it had been forged, and in that instant the whole world changed. And now, dear listener, we come to the moment toward which our whole long tale has been drifting, the fall of the Dark Tower. And though it is the ruin of a mighty thing, it is also the sweetest and most peaceful of all the turnings of this history, and we may dwell upon it gently and without any fear. For in the instant that the ring fell into the fire and began to melt away in the flames that had made it, the power that Sauron had poured into it so long ago was released and unmade, and with it went the last and greatest part of the Dark Lord's own being. All the strength that he had hidden in that small circle of gold, all the malice and the will and the years of gathered power, unraveled in a moment, and Sauron, who had bound so much of himself to the ring, was undone with it. And in that same instant, at last, the eye of the tower knew. It is told that as the ring perished, the searching gaze of the shadow, which had been fixed all this while upon the gate and the battle, turned suddenly inward, in a flash of dreadful understanding, toward the mountain and the fire, that for one blinding moment the whole terrible attention of Sauron comprehended at last the thing that had been done, the thing he had never dreamed his enemies would dare, and knew his ruin, and knew that all his ages of labor and patience and cunning had come to nothing in the very hour of his seeming triumph. But it was too late, far too late, for anything to be done. The ring was already gone into the fire, and there was no undoing it, and no power left to try. And then the tower fell, for its deep foundations, remember, had been bound and sustained by the power of the ring. And now that power was gone, and there was nothing left to hold the great edifice together, it is told that a tremor ran through all the land, and that the earth heaved and groaned, and that the burning mountain roared up in a great convulsion of fire and smoke, and that Barad-dur, the mightiest fortress ever raised by malice, which no engine or army had been able to throw down while the ring endured, now toppled all at once in a single, vast and final ruin. Its towers and its pinnacles crumbled, its walls broke and slid, its high battlements came crashing down, and the whole immense structure, tier upon tier and rampart upon rampart, collapsed into a heap of tumbling stone, so that, in a few short moments, the labor of ages was reduced to rubble and dust. The topmost chamber where the eye had burned was thrown down. The high halls where the nine had gathered were broken. The deep vaults and the dungeons and the forges were buried, and the great black shape that had darkened every horizon of that land for so long simply ceased to be, falling in upon itself and passing away in thunder and ash. And the red eye that had kept its sleepless watch over Mordor was put out, quenched forever, and never again did its light trouble the dark, nor its gaze fall upon any living thing. So ended Barad-dur, the Dark Tower, in the very hour of its master's fall, undone at last not by the might of armies, but by the unmaking of a small and hidden thing, exactly as the wise had foreseen and the shadow had never feared. And with the tower there fell also all the strength of the shadow, and the whole vast structure of the enemy's power came apart in a single hour. The armies that had beset the free peoples at the gate, and that had seemed on the very point of victory, felt suddenly that the will which had driven and sustained them was gone, and a great terror and confusion fell upon them, and they broke and fled, or stood bewildered and lordless, or cast themselves down in despair. And the battle that had seemed lost was won, not by any last stroke of arms, but because the master of the shadow was no more, and his servants were left without a will to serve. The ring-wraiths, the nine, who had been sustained through all their long, unnatural existence by the power of the rings and the will of their master, were consumed and ended in that same instant, passing away like smoke upon the wind, their long dread finished forever. And Sauron himself, the spirit that had been Mairon the Admirable in the dawn of the world, and had fallen so far into the dark, was at last so utterly diminished that he could never again take shape, nor rise, nor trouble the world in any bodily form. He became a mere shadow, a formless and impotent malice, a memory of evil borne away upon the winds, powerless forever to do more than brood in the empty places, unable ever again to build or to rule, or to raise up any tower. The shadow passed, and the sun broke through, and a clean wind came out of the west, and blew across the land of Mordor, scattering the reek and the smoke. And for the first time in an age, the light fell clean upon that dark country, and the long tyranny of the tower was ended. It is a wonderful thing to consider, dear listener, in the hush of this quiet hour, how completely and how swiftly it all passed away. For long ages, the Dark Tower had stood, seemingly eternal, seemingly unassailable, a weight upon the whole world, and generation after generation of the free peoples had lived and died beneath its shadow, and to most of them it must have seemed that the darkness would simply endure forever, that nothing could ever cast it down, that the tower was as fixed and permanent a feature of the world as the mountains themselves. And then, in a single hour, in the space of a few heartbeats, it was gone, undone, utterly, never to rise again, brought to nothing by the courage and the endurance of the small and the humble and the overlooked. All that vast and dreadful strength, all that patient malice, all those ages of labor, proved in the end to rest upon a foundation that a single act of self-sacrifice could sweep away. And the shadow that had seemed everlasting turned out to be, after all, only a passing thing, a cloud across the sun which the first clean wind could scatter and disperse. There is deep comfort in this, and we shall come to it more fully as our tale draws toward its close. But let it begin now to settle softly over you, that no darkness, however great, and no tyranny, however strong, and no tower of shadow, however high, is truly as permanent as it pretends to be, and that all of them, in the end, must fall, while the light and the small and the good endure. Let us linger a while in the sweetness of the aftermath, for after so long a shadow, it is a joy to dwell upon the coming of the light, and there is much in it to soothe the heart toward sleep. When the tower fell and the shadow passed, the two small travelers who had accomplished the great errand were left upon the very slopes of the burning mountain, spent and all but lifeless, with the fires rising about them and the land breaking and heaving in its throes, and it seemed that having achieved the impossible, they must nonetheless perish in the ruin of the thing they had undone. But they were not forgotten, and they were not abandoned, for out of the west, borne upon the clean wind that now swept away the reek of Mordor, there came the great eagles, mightiest of birds, sweeping down over the smoking land, and they found the two small figures upon the mountainside, and bore them up gently out of the fire and the ash, cradled in their care, and carried them away to safety and to healing. And there is something in that rescue so tender and so fitting that it is worth holding in the mind as one drifts toward rest, that the ones who had given everything, who had asked for no reward and expected no deliverance, who had gone into the darkness prepared to die, and had thought themselves at the very end, were lifted up and saved at the last, borne away on great wings above the ruin of the shadow into the light of a new morning. For so it often is that the deepest darkness comes just before the breaking of the dawn, and that those who endure through the worst of the night are carried, when they can go no further, into an unlooked-for morning. And across all the wide lands of Middle-earth, in that same hour, the passing of the shadow was felt, and everywhere the tidings of it came as a lifting of a great weight. Far away upon the field before the great city of the men of the West, the armies of Mordor that had beset the last host melted and fled, and the defenders who had stood in despair looked up to see the darkness rolling back and the light returning, and knew that against all hope the victory was theirs. And in every land that had lain beneath the fear of the tower, in every corner of the world where hearts had grown heavy under the gathering shadow, there came now a strange lightening, a sense of some vast oppression lifted, as when a long sickness breaks and the fever passes, and the sufferer, weak but whole, feels the first return of health. The slaves and the captives of Mordor, the wretched thralls who had labored in the mines and the forges under the whips of cruel masters, found their masters fled or fallen, and their chains broken, and though they were bewildered and knew not at first what had befallen, they were free, and the lands that had been kept in bondage were given back into kinder keeping, and the very country of Mordor itself, that had been made a machine of war and a place of torment, began from that hour, slowly and by degrees, the long healing that time would bring, as the fires died down, and the smokes cleared, and the first clean rains fell upon the ash. And of the tower itself, when the ruin had settled, and the dust had blown away, there remained only a great tumbled heap of black stone upon the shoulder of the mountains, a waste of broken rubble, where once the mightiest fortress in the world had stood. And here is a thing worth marking, and worth carrying gently into sleep, that nothing was ever built again upon that place. For the foundations that Sauron had delved and bound with the power of the ring had been broken utterly when the ring was unmade, and there was no longer anything in that ruin to draw the ambition of any later lord. The site of the Dark Tower was left to lie empty and desolate, a heap of stones slowly weathering under the sky. And in the long years that followed, the grass and the moss and the patient work of wind and rain began little by little to soften even that. The tower did not merely fall, it was, in a sense, erased, unmade so thoroughly that not even its ruin remained a place of power, but became only a scattering of stone that the world slowly forgot. And so the last and truest secret of Barad-dur was revealed at the end, that for all its towering pride, for all its ages of dominion, it had been founded upon a lie, upon the will of a spirit that had traded its own being for the illusion of mastery, and when that will was undone, the tower had nothing left to stand upon, and passed away as though it had never been. There is a stillness that comes over the imagination when one pictures that place in the years after the fall, and it is a healing stillness, and we may rest in it a while. Picture the plain of Gorgoroth grown quiet at last, the forges cold and silent, the mustering yards empty, the smoke long since blown away. Picture the burning mountain grown still, its fires sunk down and quenched, no longer roaring, but only smouldering faintly, and then, in time, not at all. Picture the great heap of black rubble where the tower had stood, lying silent beneath the open sky, the wind moving softly over the broken stones, and no eye watching, and no will brooding, and no dread lying upon the land. The clamour is all ended, the fear is all past, the armies are gone to dust, and the wraiths are gone to nothing, and the master of the shadow is scattered upon the winds, powerless forever. And over the whole of that once dreadful land there lies now only silence, and the slow, patient, gentle work of healing as the world reclaims what the shadow had spoiled, and the light comes back into the places that had been dark. It is the deep peace that follows the passing of a long storm, the quiet after the thunder, the stillness of a world washed clean, and it is the very peace, dear listener, that we would have settled now upon you as the tale draws toward its ending and sleep draws softly near. And now that we have followed the whole long history of the tower, from its first raising to its final fall, let us circle back once more, gently, in the manner of a mind drifting toward sleep, and consider again the question that gave our tale its name, and ask what, in the deepest sense, was truly to be found within the Dark Tower. For we have spoken of its forges and its dungeons, its armies and its wraiths, its seeing stone and its eye, and all of these were there, and all of them were terrible. Yet there is a stranger and a truer answer to the question of what lay inside Barad-dur, and it is this, that in all its vast extent, in all its countless halls and chambers and vaults, There was nothing that any gentle heart would call a home. Think of it, in the drowsy quiet of this hour. In all that immense fortress there was no hearth kindled for warmth and good cheer, no fire lit merely that friends might gather about it and talk into the night. There was no table set for a shared meal, no song sung for the joy of singing, no laughter, no children, no growing thing, no small kindness, no rest. There was no place within those walls where a weary traveller might have laid down his burden and felt himself safe and welcome. For the tower had been built not to shelter life, but to dominate it, and everything within it served that single cold purpose. And so, for all its dreadful grandeur, it was in the truest sense empty, a shell of power around a hollow where a heart should have been. And that, perhaps, is the darkest secret of all, darker even than the dungeons and the forges, that at the very center of all that strength there was nothing but emptiness and hunger, a will that craved and could never be satisfied, a lord who possessed a fortress greater than any king had ever held, and yet possessed nothing that could make him glad. For Sauron had traded away, long ages before, everything that might have brought him joy. He had given up love and friendship and delight in the beauty of things for their own sake, and the simple contentment of a work well made and freely shared. And he had taken in exchange only power, and power alone, which is a cold and a barren thing to hold when one has nothing else. And so the tower was, in a way, the perfect image of his ruin, a monument not to his strength, but to his poverty. For the greater and the more terrible he made it, the more plainly it showed how little he truly had. To dwell in Barad-dur, at the summit of all that power, must have been the loneliest thing in all the world, and there is a strange comfort in seeing that, for it tells us that the shadow, even at its height, was never truly to be envied, and that the smallest cottage with a warm fire and a friend beside it held more of what makes existence worth having than all the vast dark halls of the enemy's tower. Consider, by contrast, the dwellings of the free peoples, the homes and the halls that stood against the shadow, and see how different they were, and how the difference reveals the truth. In the houses of the elves there were music and starlight, and the memory of ancient beauty, and a grace that had no purpose but to be beautiful. In the halls of men there were feasting and fellowship, the telling of tales and the singing of songs, the warmth of kinship and the comfort of the hearth. In the deep homes of the small folk of the green country there were gardens and good food and comfortable chairs, and the simple homely pleasures of a quiet life well lived, and above all, a love of growing things and of peace and of one another. All of these were, by the measure of mere power, weak and small beside the might of the tower. Not one of them could have stood for an hour against the armies of Mordor in open war. And yet it was these small and homely things, and the love that dwelt in them, that in the end proved stronger than the tower, for they gave to the free peoples something worth defending and worth dying for, a reason to endure and to hope and to sacrifice, that the servants of the shadow, who had nothing of the kind, could never match. The tower could compel, but it could not inspire. It could make its servants fear, but it could not make them love. And in the last reckoning it was love and not fear that carried the day. There is a deep truth in that, dear listener, and a comforting one, and it is worth carrying with you as you sink toward sleep, that the warm and the small and the homely things you love The quiet comforts of an ordinary life are not weak at all, but are in fact the very things that all the dark towers of the world are, in the end, unable to overcome. Let us wander once more in imagination through the empty tower, but this time in the stillness after its fall, and see how even the memory of it has been gentled by time. Suppose that some traveler, ages after, had come upon the place where Barad-dur had stood, and had walked among the tumbled stones in the quiet of a clear evening. He would have found no dread there, and no watching eye, and no cold pressure of malice upon his heart, only a great scattering of black rubble upon a lonely hillside, weathered and softened by the long years, with the grass beginning to grow in the cracks between the stones, and perhaps a bird singing somewhere in the still air, and the light of the setting sun falling gold and gentle upon the ruin. He would have found it hard, perhaps, to believe that this quiet and harmless place had once been the seat of so great a shadow, that from this weathered heap of stones a will had once reached out to darken half the world. And that difficulty of belief would itself have been a kind of victory and a kind of mercy, for it would have meant that the shadow had passed so completely that it had become hard even to remember, that the healing of the world had gone so deep that the very ruins of the tower had ceased to be fearful and had become only a curiosity, a place for the grass to grow and the birds to sing. And so the last chapter of the tower's story is written not in thunder, but in silence, not in dread, but in the gentle indifference of the growing world, which takes back into itself even the greatest works of malice, and covers them over softly with green and quiet things. Come with me once more, in the softest of imaginings, and let us trace in the mind's eye the long approach to the tower as it was in the days of its standing, for there is a slow and dreamlike quality to such a journey that suits the drifting hour, and we may walk it now in perfect safety, harmed by nothing, only looking. Suppose that you drew near across the plain of Gorgoroth, from far off at first, when the tower was but a black shape upon the horizon, a darkness taller than the darkness around it. And suppose you came slowly nearer, hour by hour, and watched it grow before you, rising higher and higher into the smoky heaven until it filled the whole of the sky ahead, and you had to bend your neck back to seek its summit. You would have come at length to the causeway that led up to its gate, a great raised road of black stone flung across the broken ground, and you would have passed between watchtowers and outworks, beneath frowning walls pierced with dark windows, along a way made to make any who walked it feel small and watched and unwelcome. And the nearer you came, the more the sheer mass of the thing would have pressed upon you, the sense of unimaginable weight and strength, of stone piled upon stone in quantities beyond counting, of a labor so vast that the mind could scarcely hold it. This was by design, for the tower was meant to overwhelm before ever it defended, to break the spirit by its mere appearance, and to walk that causeway in the days of the shadow must have been to feel one's courage draining away with every step. But we who walk it only in the safe imagination of a quiet night may feel instead a kind of wonder at the terrible artistry of it, and then let the whole vision grow dim and distant as our thoughts begin to soften and to drift. Within the gate, had you passed it, you would have entered a world of iron and stone and sullen fire, and your senses would have been assailed by the whole strange atmosphere of the place. There would have been the smell of it first, heavy and bitter, the reek of smoke and hot metal, and the sharp mineral tang of the deep places mingled with fouler things, so that the very air was thick and hard to breathe and lay upon the tongue like ash. There would have been the sound of it, never ceasing, a great low undertone made up of 1,000 smaller sounds, the deep throb of the forges far below, the tramp of marching feet, the clang and clatter of iron, the harsh voices of the orc captains, the groan of great engines, the whisper of wind through the high battlements, all of it woven together into a ceaseless, dull roar that filled the halls and never fell silent, so that in all that vast fortress there was no such thing as true quiet, and there would have been the light of it, or rather the strange half-light, for there was no honest daylight within those walls, only the red glare of the forges glowing up from below, and the pale, cold gleams of the lamps that the servants of the shadow used, and here and there the dull sheen of the black stone and the iron catching some distant fire, a light that made everything seem to waver and shift, that threw long leaping shadows upon the walls, that never rested the eye nor gladdened the heart. To stand within Barad-dûr was to stand in a place where every sense was oppressed and wearied, where nothing was made for comfort, and everything for dread, and where even the air and the light and the sound conspired to remind you that you were within the house of the enemy and beneath the weight of his will. And yet, dear listener, remember always, as we wander these imagined halls, that they are empty now, and silent and gone, that the forges we hear in the mind's ear have been cold for an age, that the marching feet are stilled, and the harsh voices silenced, and the red light quenched, and the bitter air blown clean away. It is a strange and soothing thing to hold both pictures in the mind at once. The tower as it was, thronged and roaring and terrible, and the tower as it became, a scattering of quiet stones upon a lonely hill under an open sky. The one is the shadow, and the other is the truth that outlasted it, and as we drift toward sleep, it is upon the second that we may let our thoughts come gently to rest, for everything that was dreadful in that place has passed away, and only the quiet remains, and the quiet is very deep and very kind, and it asks nothing of you but that you rest within it. There were, moreover, deep places in the tower that no imagining can fully reach, ways that wound down beneath the roots of the mountain into darkness upon darkness, and it was in these that Sauron's oldest and most secret works were hidden, for a spirit so ancient and so learned in the arts of making and of marring had gathered in the long ages a great hoard of dark lore, and much of it, we may suppose, was kept in the deep vaults of Barad-dur, sealed away from every eye but his own. There would have been the knowledge of his craft, the terrible secrets of how living things may be twisted and bred and bent to evil purposes, the arts by which the fair may be made foul. There would have been the instruments of his sorcery and the records of his long dominion, and the accumulated cunning of one who had been present at the shaping of the world and had spent all the ages since in the study of how to master it. All of this lay in the deep places of the tower, brooded over by its master, and it was among the most perilous knowledge in all the world, for in the wrong understanding it could work untold harm. And here too is a mercy worth marking as we drift, that when the tower fell, all of that dark lore was buried and lost with it, sealed away forever beneath the rubble, or scattered into meaninglessness with the unmaking of the will that had gathered it, so that the fall of Barad-dur was not only the fall of a fortress, but the ending of a whole dark tradition of knowledge swept from the world so that it could trouble it no more. The deep vaults keep their secrets still, buried and forgotten under the weathering stone, and no one now shall ever read them, and that is well, and we may be glad of it, and rest the easier for it. Let us go back once more in the tale, for there is a long stretch of years we passed over lightly, and it is worth dwelling in for a while. The long quiet ages between the first fall of the tower and its second raising, when Mordor lay empty and the wise of the world kept their watch, and wondered whether the shadow would ever return. For when Barad-dûr was first cast down at the end of the great siege, and the ring was lost, and Sauron's spirit fled, diminished into the wild, it seemed to nearly all the peoples of Middle-earth that the danger was ended forever, and they turned their thoughts away from the Black Land and set about the business of living, building their kingdoms, tending their fields, raising their children, and slowly over the generations forgetting the shadow that had lain so heavy upon their fathers. And Mordor itself lay desolate and untended, a land of ash and broken stone behind its wall of mountains, shunned by all, entered by none, its ruined tower a heap of rubble upon the lonely hill, its plains silent, its mountain quenched, or nearly so, a place given over wholly to emptiness and to the slow, indifferent work of wind and weather. And for a long age it was so, and the world went on, and the memory of the tower faded into old tales that mothers told to frighten wayward children, into songs sung of ancient wars, into the dim and doubtful knowledge of a few lore-masters who kept the records of the elder days. Yet there were some, a very few, who did not forget, and who did not trust the peace, and who kept a wary watch upon the shadows of the world through all those long quiet years. And it is to their vigilance that the free peoples owed much, though few of them ever knew it. For among the wise there were those who understood the deep truth that the others had forgotten or had never learned, that Sauron had not been truly destroyed when his tower fell, because the ring had not been destroyed, that his spirit endured, diminished, but not ended somewhere in the world, and that so long as the ring existed, the shadow might one day gather itself and return. And these watchful few kept their counsel and studied the old lore, and marked the small signs that troubled the edges of the world, the rumors of a growing darkness here, the tidings of some fell thing stirring there, and slowly, over many years, they came to fear that their darkest surmise was proving true, that the enemy was indeed creeping back into the world, and that the long peace was only a pause and not an ending. It was a lonely and a thankless watch to hold such fears while all the world about them slept easy and called them gloomy for their pains. And yet it was a watch that in the end saved the world, for because a few kept vigilant while the many forgot, the free peoples were not wholly unprepared when at last the shadow did return. There is a lesson in that too, dear listener, gentle and worth carrying towards sleep, that the peace of the many often rests upon the wakefulness of a few, and that much of the good that is done in the world is done quietly by those who keep faith through long years when nothing seems to come of it, watching and waiting and holding to what they know to be true, even when all around them have forgotten. It is not a glamorous kind of goodness, this patient vigilance. It wins no battles and earns no songs, and those who practice it often go unthanked and unremembered, and yet without it the great deeds of the end could never have been done, for it was the long watch of the faithful few that kept alive the knowledge and the readiness upon which, in the fateful hour, everything depended. So let us honor them In the quiet of this hour, those unnamed watchers who kept their vigil through the long, empty years, and let their patience be a comfort to us. For it tells us that even in the times when nothing seems to be happening, when the shadow seems gone and the danger past and the watching pointless, the quiet faithfulness of good hearts is doing its slow and hidden work, and preparing, though none can see it, for the day when it will be needed. And when at last the shadow did return, and the necromancer arose in the northern forest, and the wise perceived with dread that their fears were justified, and that the enemy was indeed creeping back into the world, it was still a long and slow and doubtful business to be sure of the truth and to know what should be done. For Sauron was cunning, and he cloaked himself in disguise, and hid his true nature, so that even the wise could not at first be certain that the growing darkness was the ancient enemy, and not merely some lesser evil, some stray wraith or fell sorcerer of no great account. And there was much debate among them, and much hesitation, and years upon years passed in watching and in doubt before the truth was established beyond question, and the will to act was gathered. It is easy, looking back, to wish that they had moved more swiftly, that they had struck at the shadow before it could grow strong. But it is not so simple a thing to rouse the world against a danger that most cannot see and many will not believe in. And the wise, for all their wisdom, were feeling their way in the dark, uncertain and divided, doing their best with the knowledge they had. And in the end, though the shadow was not prevented, and the tower rose again, and the great war had to be fought, yet the vigilance of the wise had bought the world the time and the readiness it needed. And when the fateful hour came, the free peoples were not taken wholly unawares, and the long-laid preparations of the watchful bore their fruit at last. So even the delays and the doubts and the slow gropings of the wise were woven, in the end, into the pattern of the deliverance. For the tale of the tower's fall, like all true tales, is not a tale of flawless heroes moving surely to a certain end, but of ordinary good hearts doing their imperfect best against a great darkness, and finding in the end that their best had been enough. Let us dwell a while longer upon the eye, for it is the image by which the tower is most remembered, and there is much in it to ponder gently in the drifting hour. Great red eye, lidless and wreathed in flame, that burned at the summit of Barad-dur in the last age of its standing, was more than a mere sign or symbol. It was the very expression of what Sauron had become, and of the whole nature of his rule. For consider what an eye is, and what it means to be always watched. The Dark Lord governed his dominion not chiefly by law, nor by love, nor by any bond of loyalty freely given, but by fear, and the root of that fear was the sense, present always to his servants and his slaves, that they were seen, that nothing they did or thought could be hidden, that the searching gaze of their master might at any moment fall upon them and find them wanting. And so the eye upon the tower was the perfect emblem of his tyranny, a great unsleeping watchfulness, brooding over all the land, from which there was no privacy and no escape, a gaze that pried and searched and never rested, and never turned aside from its hunger to control. To live beneath that eye was to live without the least corner of the soul, left free and unwatched. And there is scarcely a heavier bondage that can be laid upon any creature than to feel itself forever seen by a will that means it no good. And yet, dear listener, there is a deep irony hidden in the eye, and it is worth marking, for it is bound up with the tower's fall. The eye that watched so ceaselessly, that searched every horizon and pried into every shadow, was in the end blind to the one thing that mattered most. For all its restless searching, it could not see the thing that was creeping toward the mountain, almost beneath its own gaze, because it was looking always always for the wrong thing, searching always for power and for armies and for a rival wielder of the ring, and never once thinking to look for humility, for weakness, for the small and the self-forgetful. The eye could see everything except what it could not imagine, and it could not imagine that anyone would seek to destroy the ring rather than to use it, and so it was blind precisely where its sight was most needed. There is a great truth in that, and a comforting one, that the watchfulness of malice, however vast, is always in the end a narrow thing, able to see only what it expects and desires, and blind to the wide world of goodness and humility and self-sacrifice that lies forever outside its understanding. The eye of the tower was mighty, and it was terrible, and it was, at the last, fooled by two small and frightened travelers whom it never deigned to notice. And in that failure of the great searching eye, there is a hope for all the small and overlooked things of the world, that they may pass beneath the notice of the shadow and carry out their quiet errands unseen. Now the tower was the seat of a whole order of dominion, and beneath its master there served a hierarchy of dread, and it is worth naming in passing some of the servants of the shadow who did its will, for they too are part of what the tower held. Chief among them were the 9, the ring-wraiths, of whom we have spoken, the most terrible of Sauron's slaves, once kings and lords of men, now shadows bound wholly to his will, and greatest of these was their captain, the Lord of Morgul, the fell king who led the armies of Mordor in war, and whose dread went before him like a cold wind. And there were other captains and lieutenants of lesser but still fearful sort, the cruel herald who spoke for the Dark Lord at the gate, a living man so long in Sauron's service that he had half forgotten his own name, and had become little more than a mouthpiece for his master's malice, and the captains of the towers and the passes, and the overseers of the mines and the forges, and the drivers of the slaves, and beneath them all the teeming multitude of the orcs, and the trolls, and the beasts, and the mortal peoples of the east and the south, who had been drawn or driven into the service of the shadow. All of these the tower ordered and commanded, a vast machinery of tyranny reaching outward from the single will at its summit, so that the whole of Mordor moved as one body directed by one mind, and no part of it acted save at the bidding of the master in the tower. And to bind this whole dominion together, and to set his own mark upon it, Sauron had a tongue of his own devising, a harsh and dreadful speech that he had fashioned for his servants, a black speech made to be spoken by cruel mouths and to carry the accent of command and of malice. It was an ugly language, grating and hard, made not for poetry or for love, or for the gentle exchange of hearts, but for the giving of orders and the working of dominion. And few outside the service of the shadow could bear even to hear it spoken, for it fell upon the ear like a curse. And it was in this black speech that Sauron had set the words of power upon the One Ring itself, a line of dreadful verse graven in fiery letters upon the golden band, words that told of the ring's purpose, to be the one ring that should rule all the others, and bind them and bring them under the shadow. Those words were the very charter of his intended tyranny, the statement of his whole design, that all the powers of the world should be gathered into one hand and ruled by one will forever, and they were graven upon the very thing whose destruction would undo him. There is a fittingness in that which is almost beautiful when one considers it from the safe distance of the ages, that the words of the ring's dominion were written upon the instrument of the rings and the towers' undoing, that the charter of the shadow's tyranny was inscribed upon the very object that a small act of humble courage would one day cast into the fire, so unmaking both the words and the will that wrote them, and freeing the world from the dominion they proclaimed. Let us return once more, and for the last time in our long wandering, to the very hour of the tower's fall, and let us look upon it now, not with dread, but with a kind of quiet awe, dwelling upon the wonder of that great overthrow, for it is the beating heart of the whole tale, and it will bear one more slow telling. Imagine yourself again borne high and safe above the land of Mordor in that fateful hour, hovering like a bird in the upper air, looking down as the last great drama unfolded far below. See, in the mind's eye, the whole vast dark landscape, the plain of Gorgoroth spread out grey and dim, the burning mountain smoking in the midst of it, the dark tower rearing black and immense upon its shoulder of rock, and away to the north, the small bright glint of the last host of the free peoples ringed about by the dark armies at the gate. All is poised, all is held in a breathless balance, the whole weight of the age hanging upon a single act, far off upon the mountain that no eye below can see, and then, in an instant, the balance breaks. Deep within the mountain, the fire receives the ring, and the power that was bound in it is loosed, and a great shudder runs through all the land, as though the earth itself had drawn a breath and let it go. And then, dear listener, comes the fall, and it is a thing to behold. The mountain roars up in a great fountain of fire and smoke, and the ground heaves. A vast tremor spreads outward across the plain, and the dark tower that had stood so long and seemed so eternal begins to totter. Imagine it, the great black shape, tier upon tier, higher than any natural thing, swaying against the lurid sky, and then the crown of it, the topmost tower, where the eye had burned, breaking and toppling, and then the whole immense structure coming apart, ripple upon ripple of ruin running down its height, the battlements crumbling, the walls buckling and sliding, the countless windows going dark all at once, as the light within them failed, and it falls, not slowly, not stone by stone, but all together, in a single overwhelming collapse, the labor of ages dissolving in a few short moments into a roaring avalanche of black stone, a cataract of rubble pouring down the mountainside, raising a great cloud of dust and ash that rolls out across the plain, and the red eye, in the instant of the fall, flares up terribly and then goes out, quenched forever, and where it had burned there is only the dark, and then the settling dust, and then, at last, the silence. So falls Barad-dur, the Dark Tower, the mightiest work of malice ever raised in the world, and it is gone, and it does not rise again, and the horizon that it had darkened for an age stands suddenly empty and clean against the sky, and with the fall of the tower there comes the wind and the light, and it is upon these that we may let our hearts grow glad and our thoughts grow soft. Imagine the change sweeping across the land, the heavy pall of smoke and reek that had hung forever over Mordor beginning to break and to lift, a clean wind rising out of the west, sweeping across the plain, scattering the ash, driving the darkness back, and above, in the rents of the parting cloud, the pale light of morning breaking through, falling clean and gentle upon a land that had not known clean light for an age. Imagine the freed captives lifting their heads, and the far-off battle at the gate breaking as the dark armies lose the will that drove them, and everywhere across the wide world the sense of a great weight lifted, a long night ended, a fever broken. It is the dawn after the longest of nights, the calm after the greatest of storms, and it is the very peace toward which our whole tale has been drifting, and toward which you too are drifting now, deeper and deeper, as the words carry you down toward sleep. The tower is fallen, the shadow is past, the light is come again, and all is well, and all manner of things is well, and there is nothing left in all that land but the wind and the light and the deep and healing quiet. And in the long years that followed, the land itself was healed, slowly and gently, as all wounded things are healed by time and patience and the kindness of the turning world. The fires of the mountains sank down and grew still, the smokes cleared away, and did not return. The rains fell, clean and cool, upon the ash of Gorgoroth, and washed it, and softened it, and in time the first hardy green things began to creep back into the edges of that desolate land. A blade of grass here, a patch of moss there, the small, brave pioneers of life returning to a place that life had long forsaken. The freed peoples who had been slaves in that land were given the fair fields by the great inland sea for their own, to dwell in and to tend, and where there had been only bondage and misery, there came in time homes and harvests, and the ordinary sweet business of living. And the ruined site of the tower was left to lie, a heap of weathering stone upon a lonely hill, harming no one, watched by no eye, slowly softened by the seasons, and the roads that led to it were untraveled, and the fear that had lain upon that whole country drained away and did not return, and the land that had been the very seat and stronghold of the shadow became, in the fullness of time, only a quiet and empty and unremarkable place, where the wind blew and the grass grew, and nothing troubled the deep peace. So thoroughly did the world heal itself of the wound that the tower had been, that in the end it was as though a great and dreadful dream had passed, leaving behind it only the morning and the light and the ordinary blessed quiet of a world at peace. There is one more thread worth following before we turn from the history to its meaning, and it is this, that Barad-dur was not the first great fortress of shadow to be raised in the world, nor its master the first dark lord to seek dominion over all things, and to understand the tower fully we must see it as one link in a long chain of rising and falling shadows that runs back to the very beginning of the world. For long before Sauron ever delved the foundations of his tower, his old master, the first and greatest of the fallen, had raised in the far north of the world an even mightier stronghold, a vast and dreadful fortress of the elder days, with deep dungeons and towering gates and a mountain of fire above it, from which he had waged his long war against the light. And that fortress, too, had seemed unassailable in its time, and had stood through age upon age of war, and had cast its shadow over the whole of the northern world. And that Dark Lord, too, had seemed to many beyond all hope of defeat, so great was his power, and so strong his defenses. And yet in the end that fortress also fell, thrown down at the ending of the elder days in a great war of the powers, broken and buried and unmade, so utterly that the very land in which it had stood was drowned and changed and lost beneath the sea. And Sauron, who had served in that fortress and had seen it fall, raised his own tower long after in the same spirit and to the same end, and it too seemed unassailable, and it too stood through age upon age, and it too in the end fell. And there is in this long pattern a truth that is worth carrying gently towards sleep, for it is the deepest lesson of the whole history of the tower. Again and again, through the long ages of the world, the shadow rose and built its fortress and gathered its power and darkened the world and seemed for a time to be beyond all overthrowing. And again, in the end, it fell. No dark tower, however mighty, endured forever. No dominion of malice, however vast, proved permanent. Every fortress of the shadow that was ever raised was, in the fullness of time, cast down, and this was not by chance, but lay somehow in the very nature of things, for the shadow was always, at its root, a thing of unmaking and not of making, a hunger and not a fullness, and such things, however great they grow, carry always within themselves the seed of their own ruin. They build upon fear, and fear cannot hold forever. They rule by force, and force breeds always the resistance that will one day overthrow it. They seek to possess and to dominate, and in the very act they hollow themselves out, until at the last a single blow at the right and hidden place is enough to bring the whole vast edifice down. The Tower of Sauron was the last, and in some ways the greatest of these fortresses of shadow, the final flowering of a malice as old as the world, and its fall was the final proof of the long truth that all such towers must fall, and that the light which seems so often weak and so often defeated is in the end the thing that endures. For the free peoples and the good and gentle things they loved and the light they served were never overthrown, though they were often beaten and often brought very low. They endured through all the ages, through the fall of one dark fortress after another, weak and small and imperiled, but never wholly destroyed, always rising again after each defeat, always keeping alive the flame of hope and beauty and love that the shadow could darken but never quite put out. And that is the shape of the whole long history, the shadow rising and falling, mighty and terrible, and always in the end defeated, and the light enduring, humble and imperiled, and always in the end surviving. The dark towers come and go, the small green places, the homes and the hearths and the growing things abide. And when at last the greatest of all the dark towers fell, and the final shadow passed, it was not the end of the light, but the end of a long night, the breaking at last of a dawn that had been so long in coming, and the world went on into an age without the shadow, an age of ordinary living and ordinary joys, which is, when all is said, the very thing that all the long wars had been fought to preserve. So the tale of the tower is, in the end, a hopeful tale, though it passes through great darkness to reach its hope, and the darkness is real, and we have not pretended otherwise, but the hope is greater, and it is the hope that has the final word. For the whole long history of Barad-dur, from its first raising to its final fall, tells us that the shadow is not eternal, that the tower is not unassailable, that the eye is not all-seeing, and that even the mightiest works of malice rest upon foundations that the courage and the love and the endurance of good hearts can, in the end, sweep away. And that is a truth to rest upon and to carry down with us now into the deepening quiet as we turn at last from the history of the tower to what it means for us, and let our thoughts grow slow and soft and ready for the sleep that is drawing near. Before we leave the history behind, let us pause upon one last curious thing, and that is the way the tower lived in the minds and the tales of those who never saw it. For a great shadow casts itself not only across the land, but across the imagination, and much of what was believed of Barad-dur was rumor and dread, and the whispered fear of firesides far away. In the villages of men in distant lands, where the very name of Mordor was a thing spoken low, and with a glance over the shoulder, there were told strange tales of the Dark Tower, some true and some half-true, and some the pure invention of frightened hearts, that its walls were higher than the clouds, that its windows never slept, that its master could see into any heart that turned its thought toward him, that no living thing that entered its gate ever came forth again. And these tales, though many of them were exaggerated, served the shadow well, for fear is a seed that grows in the dark of not knowing. And the very mystery of the tower, the fact that so few had seen it and returned, made it loom all the larger and all the more dreadful in the minds of those who had only heard of it. The Dark Tower ruled in this way over lands its armies had never reached by the simple power of a fearful name and a half-imagined dread, and this was among the subtlest and the most far-reaching of its strengths, that it could darken hearts 1,000 miles away, merely by being spoken of in a frightened whisper. Yet here too, dear listener, there is comfort to be drawn, for a power that rests upon rumor and mystery is a power that daylight undoes. And when at last the tower fell and the truth was known, the fearful tales lost their hold and shrank, and became at last only old stories, harmless and half-forgotten, the kind of tale one tells now not to frighten but to wonder at, in the safe and drowsy quiet of a night such as this. And that is the fate of all such rumored dreads in the end, that they swell monstrous in the dark and shrink to nothing in the light, and that the mystery which gave them their power is, in the end, the very thing that the truth dissolves. And so, dear listener, as we come now to the quiet close of our long journey, let us set aside the last of the history, the names and the dates and the events, and turn for a little while to what all of it means, why this old tale of a dark tower and its fall should matter to us at all, here in the stillness of our own night, so many ages removed from the shadow it recounts. For it seems to me that the story of Barad-dur, for all that it is a tale of a fortress that never was, in a land that never was, holds within it a handful of gentle truths that are as real and as near as your own slow breathing in the dark. And it is upon these that we may let our thoughts come softly to rest as sleep draws over us. The first of these truths is the one we have circled again and again, and it is worth holding to as you drift, that no shadow lasts forever. Whatever dark towers may rise in any life, whatever fears may seem for a time to darken the whole of the sky, whatever weights may press upon the heart until it seems they will never lift, they are, all of them, in the end passing things, clouds across a sun that goes on shining behind them, storms that must at last blow themselves out. The tower stood for an age and seemed eternal, and it fell in an hour, and so too the shadows that fall across our own hearts, which seem, while they last, as though they will never lift, do in the end lift and pass and give way again to light. Hold to that gently as you sink towards sleep, that this too shall pass, that the night is not endless, that the morning always, always comes. And the second truth is a companion to the first, and it is this, that the things which seem weakest and smallest are often the strongest of all, and that it is not the great and the mighty and the loud that carry the day in the end, but the humble, the patient, the quietly faithful, the small good hearts that keep going when all seems lost. For the tower, with all its armies and its terror, was brought down not by a greater army, but by two small and weary travelers who had nothing but their courage and their love and their stubborn refusal to give up, and the whole vast machinery of the shadow was undone by the very things it most despised and least expected, by humility and mercy, and the willingness of the small to bear a burden greater than themselves. There is such comfort in that, and such quiet encouragement, for it means that you need not be great or mighty to matter, that the small faithfulness of an ordinary life, the daily choosing of kindness over cruelty, and hope over despair, and love over fear, is not a small thing at all, but is, in truth, the very stuff of which the fall of every dark tower is made. The world is not saved, in the end, by the strong, but by the good, and the good are very often the small and the overlooked, and the ones who never thought themselves heroes at all. And the third truth, which is perhaps the sweetest, is the one we found in the empty halls of the tower, that the warm and homely things, the small comforts of an ordinary and peaceful life, are not weak and are not to be despised, but are in fact the most precious things there are, and the very things that all the wars of the world are fought to preserve. For remember what was inside the tower. In the end, nothing. For all its power, it held no hearth, no fellowship, no love, no rest. It was a shell of might around a hollow emptiness, and the one who ruled it at the summit of all his power was the loneliest and the poorest creature in all the world. And remember by contrast what it was that stood against the shadow and outlasted it, the small green places, the gardens and the hearths, the shared meals and the told tales and the love of friends and family, the ordinary sweetness of a quiet life among people one loves. These were the things the shadow could never understand and never possess, and these were the things, in the end, that proved stronger than all its power. And these, dear listener, are the things that are near to you now, in this very hour: the warmth of your own bed, the safety of your own room, the quiet of the night around you, the simple blessing of rest at the end of a day. They may seem small. They are not small. They are the very treasures that the tower, for all its might, could never hold, and they are yours, freely, tonight and always. So let us, as we drift now toward the country of sleep, let the whole long tale settle into these few gentle truths, and let them cradle us down into rest. The shadow passes, the light endures, the small and the humble and the faithful are stronger than they know, and the warm, quiet things of an ordinary life are the most precious treasures in all the world, more precious than any tower and any dominion, and they are near to you now, and they are yours. There is nothing left to fear, and nothing left to do, and nowhere you need to be but here, in the warmth and the quiet, letting go. The tower is fallen long ago, and the shadow is passed away, and all that dreadful history is over and ended, and cannot touch you. And what remains, when all the darkness has drained away, is only this: the peace and the quiet and the deep soft dark of a world at rest, in which you too may now lay down every burden and be still. Let the last of the day's cares loosen and slip away like leaves upon a slow, dark river. Let your breathing grow slow and deep and easy. Let the warmth gather around you. There is nothing more that you need to hold. It is time now to rest. And so, dear friend, the tale is told, and the tower is fallen, and there is nothing left now but the gentle dark, and you, and the soft and drifting quiet of the night. Let the whole of the story fade away behind you, like a landscape seen from a slow-moving boat, growing dim and small and far, until it is only a faint and pleasant memory at the edge of thought, and then not even that. You have no more need of it now. You are here, in the warmth, in the safety of your own quiet place, and the day is done, and there is nothing more that is asked of you tonight but to let go and to rest and to sink softly down into sleep. Feel how heavy and how comfortable your body has become, how deeply it rests against the softness beneath you, how there is no part of you that must hold or strive or stay awake any longer. Let your feet be heavy, and your legs, and your hands and your arms. Let your shoulders sink. Let the last small tightness ease away from around your eyes and your brow. Let your breathing come slow and deep and easy, each breath carrying you a little further down, a little deeper into the warm and welcoming dark. Above you, far beyond the roof and the night, the stars are wheeling slowly in their ancient courses, the same clean and quiet stars that shone down long ago upon the healed and peaceful land where once the shadow lay, the same stars that a small, weary traveler once looked up to see burning white and beautiful above the darkness, and took heart and went on. There is no shadow now between you and their light. The tower is gone, and the eye is quenched, and the long night of the world is ended, and there is only the soft, deep peace of the sky at rest, and the gentle turning of the stars, and the quiet of your own breath, rising and falling, slower and slower, as you drift down toward dreams. Imagine, if you like, that you are floating gently upon that quiet, borne softly as upon still water beneath the wheeling stars, carried without effort and without care, deeper and deeper into the warm and boundless dark where sleep is waiting for you, like a kind and open hand. Everything is well, everything is quiet, the shadow is long past, and the light has long returned, and all the old fears are ended and gone, and there is nothing left in all the wide and healing world but peace and rest and the soft embrace of the night. Let the last thread of waking thought loosen and slip away. Let yourself grow lighter and lighter as the cares of the day fall from you one by one and dissolve into the dark. Let the quiet carry you. Let the warmth hold you. Let the stars keep the air slow and gentle watch over you as you sink at last into the deep, sweet country of sleep where the shadows cannot follow and only good and gentle dreams await. Rest now, dear friend. You are safe and you are warm and you are held by the quiet of the night, and there is nothing left to do but sleep. May the peace that came at last to that long troubled land come now to you and settle softly over your heart and stay with you through all the hours of the dark. May your rest be deep and your dreams be gentle and your waking, when it comes, be into light. Good night, dear friend, and may your dreams be filled with wonder and light, with clean white stars and quiet green places, with warmth and peace and the gentle promise of a bright new morning. Sleep now, sleep and be at peace. Good night.